Okay, welcome to this first kickoff event of the CORC Carbon Forum. I'm smiling, but we all know what's at stake. We have in front of us a looming climate crisis and the need for independence of Russian gas in the light of the war in Ukraine. So what we need is solutions, but how can solutions become reality? That is what we're exploring today, and I say we because we had a lot of guests, but we will also explore it with you in the audience and with you who are with us today online. We have around 50 people watching online as well. We're going to take in the first part of the day to make a reality check on the energy mix, the scale, the pace, the proportions, what is needed in order to make this transition. And after the break, we'll take a deep dive into technologies with a special focus on gas, biogas, biomethane, and of course, in the light of natural gas. Our keynote speaker today will be Mr. Bruce Logan, who came all the way from Penn State University. Welcome. You will be on after the break, and he will present to you a new promising solution for green methane, which I have now heard a bit about, and I can tell you, wow, look ahead. Many of you will know each other professionally, but I hope you will also really take this event as an opportunity to get to know each other better. There'll be breaks for network, and could we perhaps see some hands here? Who's from a scientific side? Aha. Mads, you didn't raise your hand. Have we someone from political or political organizations? Fewer. Consider, you may also raise your hand at this point. Industry? Also a few, yeah. Others? Academia? Academia? Yeah, a few. Others? Who am I missing right now? Foundations, of course. Yeah, and investors. Who's from the investor side? Not many. Okay, I guess that you will have a great break when we get to that point. Okay, and the whole concept of today is that, yes, we're going to have speaks, but no one has a solution alone. So this will also be a day with a lot of debate. And when I say that, I really mean it. Because when we end today, we will do a summary. And when I say we, I mean we. So now you're warned, you're going to be a part of it, all of you. Just a few words on the housekeeping. We have toilets downstairs. If you need to leave the room during a session, then there's the door in the back. One in the back and two in the but down there's a door that you can use. Those of you who are with us online, you can post questions as well. And I have a little iPad up here, so I'll be sure to check these questions as well. Yeah? Feeling good? Good? Okay. So now let's move to the first part of it, and I'm going to invite a person up here that I think will be well known to all of you. He has originally a scientific background. He's a PhD, he's a professor. He served as the CSO of Novo Nordisk for 21 years with so many scientific groundbreaking results during that time. And today he's the CEO of the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Mads Thompson, please welcome him.
Thanks, Ida.
Mads, why are we here today?
To discuss one of the biggest challenges on Earth, I guess, planetary health.
And what does it mean to you?
The green agenda means everything. When we started the strategy process for the Novo Nordisk Foundation a year and a half ago, we literally realized that human health is a big problem that is, by the way, interwoven with the problem of planetary health. And we in the foundation are particularly focusing on scalable, cost-effective climate mitigation solutions, i.e. the CORC Center and the likes of it, but also how to create a bioagricultural and food ecosystem that is sustainable, protecting our resources, our biodiversity, and above all, being able to feed a lot of people by 2050. So I think this speaks very much to the DNA of the foundation. If you sequence our DNA, you will see it's equal parts of science, technology, and innovation. And I think the agenda for today fits that totally well. And we also like this idea, as when you started asking people where you're from. We love to do things where we can contribute across sectors, across disciplines, across biology, chemistry, biochemistry, etc. So that's the short version.
And Mads, I know that you're a person who can think big and think into the future. If you should have a look 10 years from now, what would you dream about that CORC has been able to do?
I think CORC, well, first of all, when Denmark, among other countries, adopted a strategy of 70% CO2 reduction by 2030, I think we all realized that that was very bold for the politicians to state that. It was good, but it also demands like hockey stick effect, in that the technologies were not mature and scaled at the point in time where we agreed to these goals, or they were set forth. So I think we need now to take some of the promising lab scale technologies, whether they be biological or chemical for that matter, or even in the interplay between the two, to actually find scalable solutions that will enable and facilitate the 70% reduction in CO2 equivalents. At the same time, we have a society that needs not only education at kindergarten, primary and secondary school level, but also post-service education, vocational studies, academic studies, politicians, NGOs, media. We all need to understand what is our role in the green transition of society. And there we have a very big education and outreach program in the foundation that targets all the segments I just mentioned. So we see it in a very holistic way. We can't do all of this alone, so we will work in partnerships with other foundations, the Gates Foundation and others, but also create things like the CORC Center as we are discussing today.
Okay, so if you'd say what is special about today or the CORC Forum itself, what would be the key points to that?
I think what Alfred has made very clear also during the inaugural speech when we opened the CORC Center.
Alfred Sporman, who we'll meet in a few minutes.
Sorry, yeah, Alfred Sporman. Sorry, I thought we were all insiders. No, there's no doubt that the mission-driven approach, I mean, the severity of this climate crisis is so creating a burning platform, such a sense of urgency that you have to be mission-driven. You have to know what does success in your mission look like, landing on the moon or creating gigatons of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So being mission-driven, being multidisciplinary, being curious and allowing different technologies, whether they are biological, microbial, biochemical, enzymatic, or even chemical, all of those to work together and then work together closely with the industry. It's critically important that the CORC Center really considers early on creating proof of concept of technologies that have to be demonstrably scalable and cost-effective in such a way that society can actually adopt them in the fight against the climate change.
Would you call it a moonshot, or would you call it like a realistic way for the next 10 years?
I think it's absolutely realistic. We have set together with the team at CORC, let's say, outcomes criteria for what will look good after a few years and after 5 years and after 10 years. We hope that the CORC Center will be refueled by further funds from the foundation if and when I'm sure we meet the success criteria after the first number of years. That's clearly the intention. We are a foundation into perpetuity. We would like to see maybe not a CORC Center into perpetuity, but for many years. Of course, pending success that I'm sure Alfred and his team will ensure.
Okay, and if we focus on today, what do you think will be a great outcome of today?
Well, first of all, I think it's really nice that you made the hand-raising experience, because what is critically important is that no one can do this alone. It demands sectors, academia, foundations, industry, governments to play together in a seamless way, and where everyone understands what the overarching goal is, and that it will also demand some sacrifices to get there. So to see so many different representatives from different parts, different sectors is wonderful. This is the first forum meeting in the CORC Carbon Forum series. So I really hope that we instill into each other a sense of urgency, a sense of wanting to work together, a sense of also maybe demanding a regulatory and legislative framework in EU, for instance, that will actually facilitate that these technologies have a seamless flow through the politicians down in the EU Commission and all the regulators, such that they become adoptable and can be exploited early on and don't have to wait for bureaucrats for many years to come into play. And I also hope that our own decision makers in this country, they will listen to some of the output from the discussions that we're having in this forum. So overall, I think this could be the beginning of a series of very important events where we get more and more closely together to solve these common problems.
Okay, thank you so much, Mads Krogsgaard Thomsen.
Have a great meeting.
And with this high potential and these dreams for the future, let's move into the details and see what is CORC actually about. Alfred Spormann is here. Our next speaker is Alfred Spormann, which Mads briefly touched upon, the executive director of CORC at Aarhus University. You're a microbiologist and biochemist.
Right.
And if you don't know Alfred at this point, let me tell you, he has been a professor at Stanford University for 28 years. He's original from Germany, but as he says, all the German words seems to be lacking after 20 years. He's been heading the departments of chemical engineering, civil and environmental engineering, biology, and of geological and environmental sciences. And I would almost say, of course, he's a PhD as well, and you had your PhD from Philips University in Marburg. Please, the floor is yours.
Right. Thanks, Ida. And thank you all for coming to this event. We are totally excited to have this broad audience here, and this is exactly what we need. As Ida said, we need the academic side, we need the investment side, we need the industry, we need the regulator side. And just to take, I think this is this the advancer? Okay. All right. As Mads and Ida said, we are a mission-oriented center to develop new science and early technology for carbon CO2 capture and conversion for storage and for use at scale. And that's a mouthful. And I want to focus really on the first and the last word. It's a mission-oriented center where we clearly have an outcome in mind and a task to develop science and technologies in a way that it actually can deliver carbon capture at a gigaton scale and carbon conversion. So therefore, we're not only doing good science, but it has to be in a relationship to how it is being used. So what we, and the core of the center is essentially that we want to take CO2 and have the best of chemistry and life sciences. So we are a science center integrated by an advanced systems level modeling to convert CO2 either into an inert carbon, sort of a climate inert carbonaceous material, or in a carbon material that is used, that is converted for use. And the difference in arrows here indicates the magnitudes of fluxes and the numbers that we are dealing with. And these will be difficult to emotionally comprehend. So we're talking about hundreds of gigatons of CO2 that need to be stored, captured and stored in some way. And we are talking about, between 0.1 and 10 gigatons per year of CO2 that needs to be fed into a cyclic carbon economy to replace fossil carbon. So when and just to illustrate what it means to be on a gigaton scale, there's a little cartoon that we made. Well, it's all about speed and scale, and I'll get back to that. So this is our friend Lars Nielsen, father of a family of 4 living in Aarhus University, and like every Dane produces something like 7 tons of CO2 per year. If you have this family of 4 producing the CO2, and you make this CO2 visible as an equivalent in carbon, basically after a year, this is how the living room looks like. Every year, for a family of 4. So we have a very large-scale problem in terms of volumes, in terms of mass, in terms of energy, in terms of transport that we need to deal with. So when we are going back and designing experiments and approaches, how to develop new technologies, we have to have the scale in mind, and we also have to have the speed in mind, because the longer we wait to and delay decarbonization, the more expensive it will be for us and certainly for our children, and the more irreversible the climate changes are. So in other words, we cannot hope for a regular economy to develop, that there's a new technology and that at some point market takes over. This has to go hand in hand and at the same time. So therefore, we realized early on when we designed the scientific concept for the center that it's not all about chemistry and biology. It's also about industry. In other words, can we scale up certain ideas of technologies? If we can't, we should not do the research on it. Is there enough energy available in order to capture carbon and convert that? If not, is there enough money around to build new infrastructure? What is the support of the public and policymakers? Because there will be dramatic changes coming within the next years fast because of the scale. So we realized this for our own research topics. We needed to have this discussion early on to make sure that we are focusing on the right aspects. But it's also clear that we cannot wait for technologies to be developed and then have public regulators or industries coming in, because this takes too long. So to speed this up, we decided to have this kind of conversations, high-level interdisciplinary conversations on facts, on understandings, on strategies and on solutions. And that's basically what this Carbon Forum is. So this Carbon Forum is our first of a number of series of these events where we bring different stakeholders from the field together to really discuss understandings, knowledge, solutions and strategies where we have actually no answers. But it's important to have everyone in the same room to develop a sense for community, then jointly develop some ideas on how to move forward. This is really what we want to achieve with this Carbon Forum. So there it is. It's the Carbon Forum. So this is the first one that we want to look at here. Again, don't waste a good crisis. We have 2 crises. We have the Russian gas crisis, and we have the crisis to transition rapidly to a green economy. Don't waste 2 good crises. How can we put this together? So this is what we want to talk about today. For the discussion today, which will be mainly about biogas, methane, natural gas, fossil gas, it is important to have some definitions sort of clearly defined in the beginning. So what we are talking about really is methane, CH4. That's the chemistry. And this is present in natural gas. And natural gas is of fossil origin. So whatever you do with natural gas, so methane that comes from fossil origin, you combust it to CO2 and you're adding net CO2 to the atmosphere. So therefore, the implication when you say, oh, we're doing natural gas or we are using natural gas, if you use natural gas, you will add carbon to the atmosphere. If you just mean methane, just call it methane. And that's what actually we and the speakers more or less agreed on. The other term is biogas. Well, what is really biogas? Biogas is a mixture of gas, about 60% methane and 40% CO2, that comes from anaerobic digestion of biomass. So the source is biomass. It's not a fossil carbon. When people talk about biogas in the context of methane, they typically mean the 60%. And the 60% are often recovered by either removing the CO2, but then it's no longer biogas, right? Because you removed the CO2. or by upgrading this 40% CO2 to methane, and you will hear more about that, and so that you have a total of 100%, but it's no longer biogas, but it's biomethane. But the point being here, whatever you do with this methane that comes out of this and use it for energy and convert it to CO2, it ultimately comes from CO2 because you're using biomass, and the origin of biomass is photosynthesis. So in a simple way, this is good methane, right? So keep this in mind when you talk about biomass, you actually have a gas mixture. If you're just talking about the process of converting CO2, either chemically or microbially, to methane, then we can talk about and use this renewable methane, because renewable indicates the carbon comes from CO2. If it's a biological process, then you talk about biomethane. So the difference between biomethane and biogas is, well, both comes from biology, except biogas is 100% methane. And in biogas, you have a 50-50 mixture. And that has implications of what you can do and actually how we can address and leverage the amount of biomethane in our gas supply. I just wanted to put out this definition so that we are all clear, because in reality, these words are often mixed and used interchangeably, and it's good to have a clear definition here. So that's what I wanted to say. I really hope for a lively and vibrant discussion. There will be no answers. It's all about, can we agree on a number of facts and provide certain perspectives? They're all valid, and we need to know about them now in order to find ways forward. And that's what we want to achieve. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Alfred Spormann. And now we are turning our perspective to the composition and structure, and not at least future, of the international energy system. And who would be better to talk about the international energy system than the International Energy Agency? And we are so lucky today that we have technology analyst Simon Bennett with us. Please, Simon, and before you say something, let me just give a brief introduction to you, because he is an author, or at least a part of the group of authors, to one of the most important publications every year, I guess, for you in the room here, the World Energy Outlook, of course, which I assume is some kind of Bible to many of you.
We literally call it the Bible.
You do that?
Yeah.
Ah.
Only within our four walls.
You also hold a PhD?
Yeah.
In your background, and Simon has also worked for the European Commission, so a broad background. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. I think I have something like 15 minutes. And if I've understood my brief correctly, then my job is to present the work that we've done on this year's World Energy Outlook, the World Energy Outlook 2022, with some insights into the findings relating to the main topics of discussion today, the overall decarbonization challenge, but also the future of gases, biomethane, some of the other things we've been able to pull out of our modeling. I've got a lot of charts. I'll probably go through them relatively rapidly, but I will try to tell you what the key takeaway factors from each one. Now, the problem with World Energy Outlook 2022 is that normally we're producing largely a long-term projection with a number of different scenarios that show different ways to get to the future. But this is a very, very special year. So 2022, we've called at the IEA the world's first global energy crisis. And we were already this time last year experiencing supply chain issues, increases in fossil fuel prices, the threat of inflation, recession coming out of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and what that's done to energy markets has really sent not only turmoil in terms of the economy, but also some serious hardship in all of our countries, and especially in in emerging and developing economies. So we've had to take that into account and try and answer questions about the near term and how it impacts the longer term. So I'll try and take you through some of that first, because I think it's really important background. And I hope some of that and some of the other messages give you a vocabulary for the conversation we're having later, just as Alfred just gave us the scientific vocabulary, which we mostly agree with. All right, so the first couple of bullet points I have here, right? So we have this turmoil in Russia. We have unprecedented issues in oil and gas markets, inflation. I mean, we shouldn't take this lightly, this issue around inflation and the impact on the global economy. And so as I was putting together these bullets, I thought, what's the chart that we have in our slide deck that really illustrates this well? And we have to go back to the 70s to find a time when so many countries experienced inflation that was around 6%, and that it was global. So in this, we've got two lines on the chart here. I hope everybody can read the font size I've chosen. But the advanced economies are in black, and the emerging and developing markets are in blue. And this is, comparable in magnitude to the 1970s energy crisis in terms of the, all countries in the world experiencing 6% inflation. But the steepness of that curve is unprecedented. So we've been thrown into this shock, and we're not sure how we're going to come out on the other side. And so that's why the big question for our World Energy Outlook was, is today's energy security crisis a lasting setback for energy transitions or a catalyst for accelerated action? You can imagine we spent much of the first half of the year dealing with governments' questions about how do they tackle the near-term energy security challenges. Energy security is back on the agenda politically in Europe, across the world, in a really, really big way, in a way that it hasn't been for quite some time. But the question now, I think, for our modeling teams was, how does this change our long-term outlooks? And we've got three scenarios. Bring them all up. One is, and I'm introducing these now because the acronyms are going to recur through the slides. One is a scenario in which the current policy setting that is essentially already baked in. This is legislation that is, if not passed, it is very much on the table in the countries that we look at. This is where we will go under that policy framework. The announced pledges scenario is what would happen if all countries in the world met the targets they've set themselves for tackling climate. So the EU's net zero by 2050 target is in there. China's 2060 target, India's 27 target, those are in the APS. And then the net zero emissions scenario is the one where we have modeled a more normative scenario. How do we actually get to net zero emissions in 2050 globally? So let's try and get through some charts. I'm going to introduce what I mean by the step scenario and how it comes out of this current energy transition. This is investment in clean energy globally, and you'll see that it's worryingly flat over the previous 5 years. 2021 annual investment, we saw the tip up. So this is the impact, we think, of some of these pledges that governments are making, some of the corporate pledges, finally filtering through into more investment in renewables. They become more competitive. A lot of this is in the electricity sector. But the increase that we now see to 2030 is much bigger than we were forecasting in our World Energy Outlook 2021. We've got a 50% increase in annual investment in clean energy between now and 2030. US Inflation Reduction Act, Fit for 55 package, can mention Repower EU as the EU's policy package that is supposed to tackle getting off Russian gas, Japan's green transition, China's targets. So all of these things are now filtering through into our modeling. So this is where we're going if nothing changes. We assume that governments are going to faithfully implement what's already on the statute books. And then another aspect of this concerns something that is going to be very momentous in terms of how the next 10 years plays out, and that is Russia. We can't talk about the global energy system at the moment without talking about Russian oil and gas. People are not always aware that Russia was the world's biggest exporter of oil and gas globally, 25% more in energy terms than Saudi Arabia. before this year. And this is what we said in World Energy Outlook 2021. We said oil from Russia, sure, they'll keep doing that. We said gas, they're going to actually go up. They're going to meet their targets, broadly speaking, for LNG exports in Russia. And this is just 1 year's change in our scenarios for oil and a 50% reduction in natural gas from Russia. And that's partly a policy response. It's partly the European Union saying we don't want this gas, or, in matter of fact, in some cases, Russia turning off the gas before the EU can ask them not to send it. But it's also partly the fact that Russia doesn't have many good export opportunities. We don't think that Russia is going to get back to its previous standing in gas exports by turning east, essentially. The Power of Siberia gas pipeline, 38 BCM, might come online, but China's gas demand isn't growing particularly strongly beyond that in our scenario at the moment. This is in, we were talking about units before, so when I talk about gas, billion cubic meters is the industry standard for talking about natural gas. If you want to benchmark that with a big number, 155 BCM is what Europe imported from Russia in 2021. So that's obviously a very significant proportion of Russia's exports. All right. This is then to move from the STEP scenario, just to put into context what our different scenarios say, but I'm going to try and keep this fairly brief, just to say that before the Paris Agreement was signed, the direction we thought the world was going in was one that was 3.5 degrees of global surface average temperature change. The way that we've now calibrated our STEP scenario, where we think the world is going with these policy changes this year, is that we get down to something that's more like 2.5 degrees of warming. So we're knocking a degree off through policy change and responses just since the Paris Agreement, since COP21. And then the scenario that implements the net zero pledges of all the countries, the EU's net zero pledge, etc., that takes us down to about 1.7. And that's almost 2 degrees lower, I think, than when we did the equivalent modeling last year. So we're seeing that the changes that are happening this year are affecting what we think is happening in 2030. And as you can imagine, our net zero emissions 2050 scenario gets us down to 1.5 degrees, a 50% chance of 1.5 degrees global average surface temperature rise. That's the short way to put it. I'm going to say something quickly about electricity and then move to molecules. So, and this is just, it's important to understand electricity. Everyone wants to talk about electricity, and we see the changes here as well. And one thing that I wanted to pick up here is that there's a sort of a theme within a lot of the discourse this year about the comeback of coal. So we need to sort of talk about that a little bit. I'm going to go straight to this. So this is the change in electricity generation in our STEP scenario between now and 2030. It's not absolute, it's the change. Renewables change from 90% increase in output from solar and wind globally just in this decade. Natural gas is actually up still a little bit because of growth in power generation in emerging and developing countries especially. But it's tempered a little bit because we have efficiency gains. The sort of the global efficiency of the natural gas fleet improves as more is built in with new plants elsewhere in the world. But the key thing is that despite a slight increase in coal generation this year, we actually see a global peak in coal generation just after 2025 and a 10% reduction in power generation from coal globally by 2030. I haven't got time to say much more about that, but it's very interesting, and we've released a report on the outlook for coal and the financing of how to get off coal everywhere in the world for a net zero scenario. That was just last month. And the result of this is that because gas and coal are so dominant in terms of fossil fuel emissions, electricity sector, and because, this is a key point, because the growth in renewables this decade would outpace the increase in electricity demand, which means that you're not also adding fossil fuel demand as you're adding renewables. We are currently sitting at the top of the emissions peak for electricity generation, CO2. we believe. And that splits out in terms of advanced economies coming off emissions in the electricity sector much more quickly than emerging and developing economies. So that's the big picture for electricity. And this issue, we started to really look at these peaks as we changed our scenario modeling this year. And we found another peak, a very, very important peak, which I'd like to pick up on now, in gas, which is that, well, let's come to it. Let's go through the sort of the storyline that's on the chart. Back in 2010, the IEA published some work that we called, "Are we entering a golden age of gas?" Question mark. The question mark is very important. And we projected gas demand would increase by about 2% per year over a decade. And the truth is, it's been pretty close. And 2% growth per year is very steep compared to what we now project would happen in the STEP scenario. That's 0.5% growth out to the rest of the decade, hitting a plateau at around 4,400 BCM in 2030, with essentially the decline in advanced economies towards 2050 being offset by some continued increase in emerging and developing economies. But that plateau, without future growth in natural gas demand out to 2050 in our STEP scenario, meant that for the first time we produced a sort of a current policies direction scenario where all fossil fuels peak within the scenario. And we have the peak in gas demand around 2030, we have the peak in coal demand by the end of the decade, and oil starts to plateau and then decline a little bit after that. So this is quite a pivotal moment, we think, as a result, in part, of what's happened in markets in 2022. I'm not going to get into what's happening in LNG. This is the other part of the slide. It just shows that trade in LNG becomes a much bigger part of the gas picture over the next decade. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit more about gas. So I've just presented what happens to natural gas, as we've heard from Alfred. That's fossil gas. So we've had to change our vocabulary in our World Energy Outlook and start talking about total gases rather than natural gas, because there's some parts of the economy that continue to demand gaseous fuels. So we've started to use this gaseous fuels, total gases. You'll find different things. But what we mean is natural gas plus biogas plus biomethane plus what we call synthetic methane, which is hydrogen upgraded to methane, plus hydrogen, and that's total hydrogen produced. Some of that hydrogen then gets converted on to other products. But this provides quite a nice picture of what happens in the three scenarios, because you see that the plateau in natural gas in steps is actually an increase in total gases. Total gas demand doesn't peak. In the APS, it does peak and it comes down, but we still have the overwhelming amount of gas demand met by natural gas. But in the net zero emissions scenario, we nearly get rid of natural gas completely, except where it is used to convert natural gas to hydrogen coupled with carbon capture and storage. And then we get more of a rainbow of gases, with biogas taking the top chunk, and the main part of the hydrogen picture is electrolysis of water using renewable or low emissions electricity. So we have see a fairly big role for biomethane. And if we look at where the biomethane is going, I thought this chart that was put together by a colleague of mine, Peter Zeniewski, provides quite a good snapshot of the difference in the role that biomethane plays, because he did a decomposition analysis in terms of what the biomethane replaces. And he found that in advanced economies, which would be the European Union, North America, Japan, Korea, other members of the OECD group, I suppose, it's mostly replacing natural gas. So it's mostly feeding into the natural gas infrastructure and displacing fossil natural gas. But actually, the interesting thing is that we have a large increase in biomethane use in the emerging and developing world, and it's not doing the same job. They don't have the same natural gas infrastructure that we do today. And a lot of the biomethane in those countries actually goes to places where coal is used today, in industry, but also potentially in things like cooking and other distributed applications. So this picture, I think, shows a good reminder that not all of the world looks like Europe. Not all of the world has this existing natural gas infrastructure already in place, but that gaseous fuels will still be important in energy transitions everywhere. Here's another chart. I should perhaps be wrapping up, where we have shown that bioenergy and hydrogen picture split into a little bit more detail. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is that, if you see on the bar for 2050 in terms of bioenergy supply, the two darker green colors are liquid biofuels and biogases, and those are quite even in 2050, which is quite an interesting result, I think, compared to some of scenario analyses that you might have seen a decade ago, where you'd have seen a lot of biofuels in the road transport sector. Now we're seeing liquid biofuels in aviation and shipping, but also hydrogen. And hydrogen you can now put on the same scale as bioenergy, because it's, it may not be exactly the same in absolute terms, but more or less these are of the, feeding into the energy system of the same magnitude by 2050. And this is in our NZE scenario. And there again, you see in 2021, hydrogen isn't something new. There's 900 million tons of CO2 that are produced from hydrogen production today. And so we really need to phase that out, the dark red or purple chunk on the left, and bring in low carbon, low emissions hydrogen to replace that. I should probably skip through some of this, although I think the interesting point on the right-hand side of this chart is that we are now also changing our definition of energy investment and the energy system to include the critical mineral value chains that are going to feed into batteries and to feed into renewable energy production systems. And when we talk about energy security this year in terms of natural gas, we're going to be looking a lot more at energy security in terms of these value chains. And asking the question, I think this is a good question to sort of close with today, how, as we transition from today's energy infrastructure to one that is more renewable-based and likely more electricity-based, how do we do that whilst also maintaining the security and resilience of the existing infrastructure that's going to continue to deliver a lot of the energy that we need? It may be the natural gas infrastructure, it may be the liquids fuel supply infrastructure, but there's a lot of focus on building up the new, and we need to not neglect the old. This year has certainly told us that the security of energy cannot be neglected. And those are my 4 key conclusions, which I'm sure you can all read directly from the slide. Thank you very much.
Simon? Let's just take time for a couple of questions, though. I'll have one, and please let your voice be heard as well. You said we were on the peak concerning CO2 emissions from electricity production, or at the point of it right now. But still, you also have when you look into the future economy, and then you will also see that you will have a larger demand for electricity in all kind of sectors, in energy production, but also wherever, industry, wherever. Did you put that into your calculations, that you will have such a huge demand side for electricity?
I mean, yes, but I'm going to qualify the answer because
Thank you.
The key result was that in the STEP scenario, we are sitting at this peak. Now, the STEP scenario is the current policy outlook in all of the countries of the world, which doesn't necessarily have such a big upsurge in electric vehicles and heat pumps and all the rest of it as you would find in the other scenarios that go much further in terms of tackling climate change. So that result for the STEP scenario is really saying that we see markets as they are gearing up to supply most of all of the new demand around the world from low carbon sources, and in advanced economies, places like Europe, displace existing fossil generation with those sources, regardless of where demand goes.
So even in a very electric future, you would say we were at the peak now?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, could we have a microphone we'll take this one. Just because there are people sitting online, so if you could introduce yourself to the rest of the
I'm
group.
Claus Felby, Novo Nordisk Foundation. Thanks a lot for a great overview. With the increase in solar and wind, there's a greater need for energy storage, backup. Do you see gas playing a role there, or do you see other technologies coming that can fill that demand?
Gases or natural gas. So yes, we model the electricity system with much higher percentage of solar and wind. We almost see, in many cases, those coming in inevitably, and the system has to respond and manage that. We don't envisage a system that can only use batteries for backup. In terms of cost effectiveness, so the key issue is, where is the flexible, dispatchable generation coming from in our scenarios that go further in terms of squeezing fossil fuels off the system, so biogas plays a role, but you start to do things in that net zero scenario that include shipping electricity across the ocean in the form of ammonia and putting it into turbines in Japan and things like that. So yes, you need that flexible generation.
We'll have a last question from down here.
Yeah, great talk. Markus Remmers from Nova Holdings. You asked the question in the beginning, are the recent events in Ukraine accelerating the move towards 1.5 degrees or moving away from it? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. I didn't answer it explicitly, directly. We think that they're accelerating it. We think that this is the inflection point at which we stand pushes us more quickly towards a cleaner energy system.
Well, that's a great news, isn't it? In a very dark time.
Yeah, exactly. In amongst some not so good news.
Okay, thank you, Simon Bennett. You will join us later for our panel discussion, but thank you for your points for now. And now we are turning to, okay, we get the rest of it up here right now. And while you are watching this movie behind me, I will say that we're now turning to the Danish side of the energy system. Stig Uffe Petersen, where are you? You're here, right? You are the Deputy Director General at the Danish Energy Agency. And Stig has, if you don't know him, had several other positions, senior positions, working with the EU side of the Danish administration concerning climate and energy. And you've also been around with the business side of it, which makes it a pretty perfect combination for today. Please.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you very much for the invitation. My main responsibilities are renewable energy in all forms, from onshore wind and solar to offshore wind and biogas and biomass. I'm also responsible for our work in the agency regarding power to X and hydrogen. So I'll be talking mainly about that. I will be talking about the regulatory framework that we have, but but also some of the what I would call larger implementation projects for us at hand right now. So this is basically it, our approach to decarbonization and climate neutrality, our ways of increasing renewables in our grid and in our system, our ways of using that electricity in terms of power to X and hydrogen, and finally I'll be touching upon carbon capture and storage, which has become in the Danish climate policy a very large tool in our toolbox. So just moving on to the Danish approach to climate neutrality, I think the goals set with broad political support are very well known among you. 70% reduction target in 2030 compared to a 1990 baseline, and climate neutrality by 2050. Those are the ones we have today. We may have new ones in the future. I'm not aware of that, but those are the ones we have today. They're anchored in our climate law. We are well on course to having 100% renewable electricity in our grids. We still have, and hopefully also in the future will have, a very high rate of security of supply. And we are working in Danish Energy Agency with, I think, 22 countries around the world. And some of these figures are rather unique also in an international context. And they're due to a number of success stories and competencies that we have developed since the first oil shock in 1973. They're based on a diversification of supply, a drive of renewables into the system. They're based on the ability to integrate renewables, fluctuating variable renewables into our system through flexible consumption, through an electricity market that works, through power plants that are flexible. They are based on energy savings and energy efficiency, district heating, the use of surplus heat in our industry sector, and they're based on a very comprehensive model for energy forecasting and modeling. So these are some of the competencies that we have used so far. The question is, of course, what will be the tools when we turn to the other side of the 50%, when we go from 50% of renewables in the system to 100% renewables in the system. In our view, electricity will play a very large role in the future. And it will be one of the sort of primary drivers towards climate neutrality. Part of this will, of course, be direct electrification because of the efficiency gains from electrical vehicles and electrical heat pumps. So we will see an electrification of our heating sector, of our transport sector, and also of large parts of our industry sector. Part of that is it's not possible to electrify it directly, so we will be looking also at indirect electrification through hydrogen and through power to X, which naturally will play quite a large role when it comes to hard-to-abate sectors such as heavy industry, heavy transport, aviation, and maritime transport. So electricity will be one of the main drivers. I'm well aware there are other instruments in the toolbox, such as negative emissions and so on, tools in the agricultural sector. But for a majority of our emissions, electricity will, either direct or indirect, will be a key tool. And you may wonder, where is all the electricity going to come from? In our view, we will, in the next 10 years, be looking sort of free avenues for gaining electricity. We'll be looking into quadrupling our electricity onshore, which means that we'll have 4 times as much electricity from onshore wind and solar. That holds the advantage not only of the cost of onshore wind and solar PV being cheaper, but also the advantage that we may be able to drive that into the system a bit earlier than our offshore wind, which would be useful when we want to scale up our hydrogen production. We'll also be looking at, over the next year or two, of tendering away more than 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. This may include some sort of overplanting, so it could be more than 9 gigawatts. Our latest tender was 1 gigawatt, so we're looking at 10-fold increase here. Part of those 9 gigawatts will be our energy island in Bornholm, consisting of 3 gigawatts. And then sort of the moving beyond the traditional way of tendering away offshore wind parks, we will in the future have the energy island in the North Sea, which will be the largest construction project in the history of Denmark. Fully completed, we'll be looking at least 10 gigawatts by 2040, and by 2033 the plan is to have 3 gigawatts online from the North Sea. So we'll be needing a lot of electricity. We have 3 avenues sort of how we're going to get there. This is basically for our Danish consumption, so to speak, but the interesting aspect of the energy islands is the is also the cross-border and cross-national potential that they hold. They are not only going to be power plants at the sea for Danish electrification or Danish hydrogen production, they're going to be part of a wider European network. And actually both the energy island of Bornholm and the energy island in the North Sea will hold interconnectors for the west of Europe. And that is very much in line with the ambitions set not only by Denmark, but also by surrounding countries in the North Sea. In this case, the Esbjerg Declaration was from both Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. And basically, this represents the ambition not only to power yourself nationally, but also to power the rest of Europe and the transition in the rest of Europe. And of course, here the numbers, specific numbers of 150 gigawatts in the North Sea is even higher than the ones we have. But basically, it's a question of exploiting and using the North Sea to produce the electricity that's needed for the transition in Europe. Now, the electricity is going to be used to a large extent in terms of hydrogen production and power to X. This will account for a very large share of our electricity consumption in the future. The climate agreement in June 20 called for a power to X strategy for Denmark. We have in the Danish Energy Agency been doing quite extensive work on that, and a number of those publications are on our website. But basically, the Power to X call was met by a strategy in 2021 and followed up by a political agreement earlier this year that sets the target of having 4 to 6 gigawatt of electrolysis in Denmark by 2030. It sets the ambition to establish a hydrogen network in Denmark. It sets the ambition to sort of drive Europe towards working with the uptake side of PTX. The production cost of hydrogen, green hydrogen, is still larger than natural gas. So we will need instruments also on the regulatory side in European Union to ensure that we have an uptake of hydrogen and other Power to X fuels. We also have, with the Power to X strategy, now a Power to X secretariat in the Danish Energy Agency that will work with the regulatory side on this. We are dealing with a complete new sector, so keeping the knowledge base of this sector, keeping knowledge of prices and market developments is an important step. The other part of the portfolio of that secretariat is actually to look at some of the barriers that are preventing the rollout of this, be it in terms of licensing or be it in terms of economic incentives. We are right now preparing the first tender for hydrogen production in Denmark, which of course will help to bring down the costs of producing hydrogen. And maybe more interesting also on this side is that while we've been working as bureaucrats and preparing things and are setting things up, the market is developing. Now, the target set by the government is 4 to 6 gigawatts of electrolysis. The current figures we have right now from projects out there on the way, but at very different stages, is somewhere between 7 and 14 gigawatts. So maybe the market here is actually outpacing the planning that we are doing. Just a few words on the interest that we have on PTX. Of course, it holds a very large potential in terms of reducing emissions in hard-to-abate sectors, but it also holds several advantages from the Danish perspective here. It works very well with the abundance of wind resources we have in the North Sea, which are fairly competitive also on an international level. The concept of doing electrolysis works very well with variable and fluctuating renewable resources. We run them when we have an abundance of wind, and we turn them down, or not turn them off, but turn them down when we have less of wind. So there is a very good match with an electricity system running on renewable energy. They produce an abundance of surplus heat that we are able to use in Denmark due to our district heating system, and of course the electrolysis and the production of power-to-X fuels allows us to use some of the green CO2 that we have from either biomass or biogas production in Denmark. So there is a very good fit with the energy system that we have in Denmark. And that's just from the energy side. If you look at the sort of the supply chain and the value chain and the know-how and also the large consumers, be it shipping companies and so on, there is a match also with wider competences in Danish industry. So that's part of the reason why we are so keen on exploiting this. Lastly, let me turn to carbon capture and storage, which is probably the sort of the latest tool in our climate toolbox, and it's a fairly large tool. There are right now 3 avenues of funding, totaling more than 36 billion Danish kroner, more than 5 million euros, that will be fed into various tenders. For carbon capture and storage, for doing negative emissions, or for doing reductions on the industry side. We have a political agreement on using CCS in Denmark in hard-to-abate sectors, and doing negative emissions. That's actually something that seems natural today, but if you go 10 years back, this was not in part of the Danish toolbox, so to speak. We are moving into enabling storage and transportation in Denmark. So this is becoming a toolbox. When we talk about building the supply chain in Denmark, we're currently preparing the first tender for carbon capture and storage, totaling 8 billion Danish kroner, that will be catching 400,000 tons of CO2 in 2026. We are doing work on the regulatory side in terms of agreements with other countries. We're working locally with 6 clusters in around the country in order to get input on where is local infrastructure needs and where are local infrastructure needs. And we are working hard now to secure the storage side, granting the necessary licenses on the storage sides. So carbon capture and storage is coming. We are well underway, but I need to stress that it's also a new tool in the toolbox. And those of you who have been following closely the tender that we have up right now will also know that it's a fairly complex process, which has run into a bit of delay, which is normally when you're tendering away new things and doing tenders with negotiations. But it's complex, but we're working on it. Thank you. I think that was from my side.
Just a single question, I guess, or perhaps 2. When we talk about your role as an energy agency, obviously you have a task about implementing the politician's wish, but there is also like the reality for people who are sitting on the other side, who needs permissions or needs to get through with different projects, and sometimes that can be an obstacle as well. So my question would be, how do you work with it, and what can people who are in the room do to push on to make this part of the transition go more smooth?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that whenever we implement projects like this, we don't go into a room, close the door, and then sit in there for 3 years and come out with a regulation. I know sometimes that's the impression, but that's not actually the case. And I think the best example is the way we've done with offshore wind. We have been able to make offshore wind compatible, to drive down the cost of building offshore wind, and the way we've done that have been with continued interaction with the industry. Continued interaction with risk reduction, and by reducing risk, you're also able to bring down the costs of offshore wind. So we continue, whenever we do, and that's the same for PTX and CCS, we continue to have market dialogues, and we continue to adjust whatever we can to make things cheaper and faster.
But what can people do to help you become the best agency?
Well, knock on our door. come and drink a coffee. We've had numerous encounters with offshore wind developers on timelines and schedules and what can be done. We're doing the same with the CCS tender right now, working closely with the bidders in order to optimize the things. And then, of course, I mean, there is. I think what you're hinting at is also the licensing part. Can you reduce the licenses? Can you speed up the licensing process? We are with you on that. We will do almost everything to speed up the licensing process. Some of the licenses we cannot make go away. I mean, part of this is environmental impact assessments that exist for good reasons. So we will need to do those. But we have a constructive approach to developers in this, in the sense that we work with them and we try to find solutions.
Okay, let's have a question down here.
Impressive overview of development, the development we are looking into. In a security of supply, the European energy system you sketched is a fine, very, very, very finely tuned instrument. What we see now, I just installed a heat pump and I'm just putting all the money I have into that heat pump every day, and a little bit more. Is this system now, is this sufficiently resilient? Have we learned something from the crisis we are in now? We also see changing weather patterns. The wind is coming from the east all the time. It didn't used to do that, and there's much less energy in that wind. Have you thought that into the big Excel sheet? Or is it something, is this the white elephant the thing that seemed impossible until it happens, and then it's really just, oh, it was obvious it would happen?
Yeah. Well, I think, Klaus, we haven't fought the Russian invasion of Ukraine into our energy system model. I have to admit that we haven't done that. But so besides that, I would say the system is based on market signals, and for the system to work, you need to have some sort of price peaks and price lows. So that has been fought into, but there's no doubt that in the second half of the green transition, we'll be looking more closely at security of supply, for instance. We will, as your last question to the previous speaker was also on backup capacity, and that of course will be very important. But it's a question of also, I mean, letting the price signals work, because when the price signals work in the electricity market, there should be producers there who are able to bid in capacity.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Uffe Petersen. Now we will be entering the world of modeling, and modeling on a scale and capacity which I think will need the kind of PhD that Marta Victoria has. She is right now associate professor at Aarhus University, educated from Technical University of Madrid, in the Solar Energy Institute, and she has done some work. Let's have a look.
Thank you. All right, welcome everyone to this presentation, which we have entitled, Which Handles Do We Need to Tweak to Speed Up the Green Transition in Europe? And I would like to start giving you a little bit of an overview of where are we in terms of where do we get our gas from and for what are we using the gas. So you can see on the left a picture of Europe. The pink bubbles are the gas demand in 2019. Before the COVID year, which is a little different in terms of energy consumption. You can see big consumption around Central Europe. But then what is more important is the blue shades, which represent what percentage of the total energy demand is covered by gas. So those countries that are plotted in dark blue, they are using a lot of gas, so they are very sensitive to changes in the gas price or in the gas situation. And then on the right, we have plotted Where are we getting the gas from? We already know more than 1/3 is coming from Russia, and then we have another countries supporting or providing gas to Europe. And the last thing is, for what do we use gas in Europe? And of course, we use the gas in industry to supply energy and as a feedstock, mainly to produce hydrogen. We also use gas to produce electricity in power plant, but also in combined heat and power plants. And then what is more challenging, we currently use around more than 1/3, almost half of the gas consumption to provide heating, mostly in individual houses, those that are not connected to district heating system. And that's a huge challenge to substitute that gas consumption. So if we go one slide more, what I want to present today is the summary of a recent paper that we wrote this summer. So when the whole crisis started, a couple of the PhDs in my group, team, and Eve, they led this research, this paper, in which we were trying to understand, okay, what are going to be the implication in long term of reducing the gas imports in the European energy transition. So what's going to happen, because we have always considered gas as a transition technology, but what's happened for the energy transition if we don't have this gas? So I want to, the paper is quite long, but I want to make sure that I make these 4 points. The first one is following a path compatible with increasing temperature only by 1.5 degrees that relieves Europe's dependency on imported gas. The second point is that for this to be a reality, we need a massive ramp up of wind and solar PV capacities. And that's much bigger and faster than we have seen in the past. My third point has to do with the fact that limiting gas, or the gas usage, requires also ramping up heat pumps faster than we have envisioned before. And we also need to fully utilize all the biogas potentials. So let me start showing a little bit our modeling approach, and that's, I promise, the only slide in which I'm going to include equations at all. But I want to give you a little overview of what we do, or the modeling approach that we follow. So we look for cost-optimal system, and that means we are looking for the best combination of generation technologies, storage technologies, maybe transmission technologies, increasing transmission between countries in Europe, and of course variable costs associated to fuel or other variable costs. So we want to minimize all of that, but of course we want to add some constraints to represent real physical limitations. Some of these constraints will be binding, so we'll be having a strong effect on the result, some other not at all. And that's where we can learn from that. How strong is one of the physical limitations that we impose in our model? To give you some examples, so one constraint can be, of course, we want to make sure that the generation and balance is enough to supply or demand in every time step and in every node. So we want to make sure that the system is working. But also we want to make sure that the system is the cheapest possible, but making sure that the CO2 emissions are below a certain limit. And I would also like to mention that for all our system we are taking the cost and technology parameter assumption from the DEA, the Danish Energy Agency technology data. So that's a very useful set of data that we use in our model. All right, and then once we have this kind of global overview, let me also mention a couple of extra elements that are important for our modeling. First, we use an open model. The model also includes a network representation. So we don't model only Denmark, but Denmark is well connected to the countries around, and so are all the different countries in Europe today. And we also have a nice representation of how good is the wind resource, shown in this, the onshore wind, shown in this map in the green color scale, but also solar, offshore wind. So it's important to capture the spatial distribution of technologies and how the network can be used to balance those fluctuations. And then on top of the network, we need the sector couple. So we are not only modeling electricity, but also the heating sector, the transport sector, the industry, and how much they consume as energy and a feedstock, and the complete carbon cycle. So to give you an idea, when we look at Europe, we have a detailed spatial representation of the industry sector. So where are the different industries located today? Which kind of industries are those? What are their energy consumptions? And what would be when they are modified? So we stop consuming, producing steel the way we do it today, and we start using direct reduced iron. That will require extra hydrogen demand in some of those locations. And with this framework, what we did in this particular paper is trying to understand what are the implications of reducing gas on two different transition or potential path. So what are these two? Well, we know that there is a linear relation between cumulative CO2 emissions and temperature increase. So roughly, historically, from 1850, we have emitted around 2,000 gigatons of CO2, and that as a consequence, temperature has increased a little bit more than 1 degree. If we want to make sure that we limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, well then there's only a limited amount of additional CO2 that we can put on the atmosphere. We call this carbon budget, and for 1.5 degrees, around 400 gigatons. Maybe we don't want to be that ambitious, and we will be happy with 2 degrees temperature increase. That means our carbon budget will be slightly higher. So the first question that we ask is, okay, for Europe, if we are currently today, we can achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, but we can do it following two different pathways. We can follow one compatible with 1.5 degrees. That means a lower cumulative emissions, or we can have a path that still gets to carbon neutrality by 2050, but has a higher cumulative emissions. No, so it's a less ambitious transition path. So these are the two, and both options are compatible with our current target as European of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. The difference is on how do we do while getting there. So in this paper, we look at these two pathways, and then we ask, okay, what if on top of these two pathways, we impose limiting the use of gas? So mainly we set up an additional constraint saying, can we do this transition without importing gas from Russia? What are the consequences if we do that? All right, so let me show some of the results. The first thing that we learned while doing this analysis is that if we follow the 1.5 degree path, that quickly relieves Europe's dependency on imported gas. And that's something kind of intuitive. If we transform our system fast, we don't need to rely that long or that much on Russian gas. So we can well align being ambitious from a climate point of view and also increase energy security in Europe. And what I'm showing here is the difference between the path using Russian gas to that not using Russian gas. So for the 1.5 degree, you can see that this gas limit is almost not playing any role or not affecting the system after 2030. So still, and that's because the 1.5 requires getting rid of natural gas earlier. So that's not an additional constraint. However, if we are following a slower transition, we are following a transition compatible with 2.5 degrees, then not having or not enable importing Russian gas is an additional constraint, so makes the system more difficult. And how is that the system trying to substitute the missing gas, the gas that cannot be imported from Russia? Well, it's using different technologies. It uses more wind, more solar, more biomass, more heat pumps, but also, and this is a cost optimization, more coal. And I don't want to say that this is the way to go. I'm saying that this is what the model says if we are not ambitious enough and we cannot use gas. And then where this is happening in Europe depends. So mostly Northern Europe uses more wind, Southern Europe more solar, and Eastern Europe ends up using more coal. So that was the first point that I want to make. The second point has to do with, okay, how do we get to 1.5 degrees compatible pathway? Well, that requires a massive ramping up of wind and solar. How massive? Well, you can see here the evolution for the 1.5 degrees. Wind and solar in yellow and blue needs to quickly ramp up before 2030. While for the 2 degrees, they can slowly, I mean, not slowly, but slower than here, get to the installed capacity required in 2050. So what numbers are we talking here about? Well, we're talking about extra or additional capacities of 500 gigawatts per year of wind and solar. That's roughly 6-7 times larger than our historical maximum. So that requires a massive ramping up. But its path always also allows us to get rid of the Russian gas imports, as I mentioned below. And we need to make sure that we know that the technologies are there. Wind and solar are today the cheapest option, but we need to make sure that the regulatory frameworks, public acceptance, everything is in place to be able to ramp up so quick. All right, let's go to my third point. Limiting gas, and I will say here, I should have, sorry Alfred, I should have said here natural gas. So limiting fossil gas requires also ramping up heat pumps. The current Repower EU, that is our kind of guideline or our target for 2025, includes 10 million heat pumps. What we see in our model is that it's cost effective, is the best economic option to go faster, roughly to install 20 million heat pumps, to go as fast as twice, including Repower EU. And why is that? And that's a little connected with the discussion of balancing. Well, the problem with heating demand is that it shows a huge seasonality. So I'm showing here for the whole Europe electricity demand, showing some difference in winter and summer, that's the whole year. Electricity demand, transport demand, but then in orange you can see heating demand. And there's a large differences in winter and summer. We are currently dealing with that seasonality using fossil gas that can be stored, or can be dispatched. If we want to make sure that we can not use gas for doing that, we need heat pumps and we need storage. That's a larger, let's say, challenge compared to electricity demand. And remember the first slide, almost 50% of the gas that we use in Europe today is used for this, for balancing this. Then the fourth point that I want to make has to do with the biogas potential, using the biogas that we have in Europe, upgrading that into biomethane, and substituting fossil methane with that upgraded biogas. Well, what we see from the point of view of the model is that all the potential assumed is quickly utilized by the model. So it's the best option from this holistic point of view. For the 1.5 degrees scenario, that's already happening in 2030. So already in 2030, the model wants to use all the biogas potential available. For the 2 degrees scenario, that you remember is a slower transformation, that's a reality in 2050. So that's part of the strategies to substitute methane, natural gas. The other strategy is to use synthetic gas, so combining electrolytic hydrogen and CO2 capture, produce synthetic gas, and our model uses a similar amount, around, biogas is around 320 terawatt hours per year, synthetic gas is around 400 terawatt hours per year. And that in both cases appear towards the end. So that's very expensive, it's a very expensive way to do it, but it's a key to achieve a carbon neutral system. And with this, and kind of the final repetition of the form message, I think I will stop here and open the floor for discussion. And I'll be happy to answer any question or keep discussing whatever question you have.
Thank you, Victoria. And you will stay up here?
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. And Simon Bennett, you will join us as well. And Teresa Scavenius is down here, excellent. And Ulrik Bang is here as well. I hope you're all mic'd up and ready to go. What do you hear? Her omkring, så det nok fint. Yes. Two of you we know already.
Hi. Hi. Teresa. Hi.
Ulrik.
Teresa Scavenius, to those of you who won't know her on forehand, is a member of the parliament of the party Alternative, which is the Green Party of Denmark. Would that be a fair way to say it?
So, yes.
And you also have an academic background here, which suits perfectly into what we are going to discuss now. And Ulrik, you come from the Danish Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. Senior Director on Energy and Environmental and Climate Policy. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to do a little reality check on all these wonderful visions and scenarios. And I think we should start with you, Simon, and think about your three scenarios. You had them pointed up to us. What would it take to move the world from the left scenarios, the step scenario, and move them towards the right scenario? Who do you see do intelligent solutions here?
We take it's a very global view. So, first of all, I showed a little bit of the distinction that we show between advanced economies and emerging and developing ones. And the problems and the issues are very different between those two. So it's a really interesting question to ask, who do we look to for inspiration, for good policy guidance. And the right answers are going to be dependent on whether the policies chosen are solving the problem that is pertinent to the country that I'm in. Now, we've had a very good start in a much larger set of countries than we expected over the last few years in terms of setting targets. So it's amazing to think now that, I don't know, is it 80 or 90% of global energy demand is now from a country that has a net zero target before 2070. So that's obviously good practice. And then in terms of what types of policies are going to be appropriate for really getting down these curves, the types of things that take you from incremental progress, which is how do we get cost-effective deployment of renewables, which is contracts for difference and good permitting, that keeps you on a steps pathway to then make this shift going off onto the more steeper downward curve, really sending signals about the milestones by which certain activities are no longer tolerable is something that we're seeing countries doing increasingly, and setting dates for the phase out of coal-fired power, setting dates for the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles. I mean, they feel like quite retrograde policy measures, but we're talking about such a distinct shift onto a new pathway that you actually do need to send some of those market signals. And just picking up on the discussion around the needs of different types of economies, one thing that we've been talking a lot about this year around the crisis is the challenge in terms of the higher interest rates and costs of capital that are faced by the emerging and developing markets. Because a couple of percentage points in terms of the cost of capital on a solar plant can double the cost of the actual solar power produced. And it's in those countries where we're going to deploy, I think it's more than half of the energy infrastructure over the next, up to 2050. And there is now much better talk about how do we channel the capital at lower cost. And it really involves the advanced economies, the European Union, and the World Bank and others in that discussion. And it was nice to see at COP27 that came out quite strongly.
Right. Marta, when Simon Bennett left us, we were on a positive and optimistic note that everything will be just fine. And then you gave us a number about the number of heat pumps that we need, just to take an example, that we need to have installed in 2050, till 10 million heat pumps. Whoa. Could you give us an idea about the proportion of the task that's lying ahead of us?
So I think a way of giving an idea, for instance, with the wind and solar capacity, we need to take the record year in Europe, in which we install, we need to look at the countries doing properly or having had records like Germany and other countries, multiply that, let's say, by 5, and keep that for the next 10, 15 years. So we need to increase the effort 5 times and keep that pace for 15 years. And I think there are different kind of technologies that we need, but those technologies that we need to decarbonize the electricity sector, that are mainly wind and solar, those technologies have made their job. The technology is there, but we need to make sure that this fast deployment is achievable. And then we need frameworks, regulatory frameworks that enable that. Simon mentioned something that is very, very important. Those technologies, most of the cost is capital cost, is when they are installed. So we need good access to capital money, or we need decreasing the risk so that investment become easier, or capital becomes cheaper. And then we also need to make aware or be aware of citizens and how they perceive this transition. The issue with distributed generation of wind and solar is that it's very intensive in the territory. And I talk a lot with people around Aarhus, and I can see there's some opposition to new large solar plants, windmills, I think we need to, as a society, discuss what are the trade-offs that we want to make if we want to reach the 1.5 scenario, and how do we do that?
And that's a wonderful bridge to you, Teresa.
Yes.
Because that is basically a political question, right? With a public that has to accept if you want to take a pace at that scale that Marta is delivering. How do we do that?
Yeah, so first of all, the citizens is not the main problem here. Actually, most people, at least in Denmark, is pro more climate politics. The main issue is really that we have a fossil fuel industry that is hindering that we're doing politics in this regard. So I think it's really, really dangerous to make the normal citizens to the problem here. We should look at the system, for example, COP27, who was there, who paid for it, who was the biggest delegation. And here we see that the fossil fuel industry has fully swarmed the whole system. So I think that is a problem on all layers, on the global level, European level, but also in Denmark. So that is the problem from my perspective. So if we want to do what you are saying, I think this is really the way to do. Have a budget, thinking about it, making the necessary political decisions. We should think about why are we not getting these decisions? We're now having a government that is trying to make a coalition, but I think they don't care so much about these problems we're discussing here. So I think we can continue discussing, talking, without nothing happening if we're not understanding why there's so little interest in actually making this modernization of our technology. Because what I actually see is really a modernization process where we have the old technologies, those who have the horse industries is really dragging us down instead of just having all these smart new cleaner technologies that I think for everybody would be more affordable and more healthy.
And Ulrik, as somebody who's representing the Danish Chamber of Commerce, which obviously have a lot of interests in producing and delivering these technologies, you have said that the 2020s should be a decade of action. But how do we get to that scale that is needed here?
I think first and foremost we need to ask the simple questions. So when you're sitting here and listening to all of us, I think you should ask yourself two questions. Will what they are saying or what policymakers or bureaucrats are saying, will that actually, because the solution is simple, we should reduce demand, the consumption of gas, fossil fuels. So any policy making talking about solutions, will that actually reduce demand, consumption? That's the first question. The second question you should ask, will what policymakers are doing, will that actually increase supply of clean alternatives? And if you can, and that's the two questions you should ask in any debate, any policymaker, any lobbyist you're talking to when they're giving you a solution. You should do this and this. I think that is the question, especially you, Teresa, should ask yourself, will that actually deliver on these two questions? Because what we are seeing, and that is the problem, what we're seeing today is actually, in Europe at least, it's the same we saw in 2014 when Russia went into Ukraine the first time. There's a lot of discussion about Russian gas, and what happened? Nothing. So what are we seeing now at a European level? It's actually the same. So we are talking about making tax on renewable energy, distorting or putting risk on investors for renewable energy, which is actually what we don't need. But we do that because we are talking about energy bills. We're not talking about will that actually increase the deployment of the alternatives. And we're not talking about will that actually giving them rebates on energy bills, will that actually lower our consumption of natural gas? No, on the contrary, it will actually increase our demand for natural gas. So I think it's a policy problem, and perhaps it's a lack of brave politicians actually trying to listen to bureaucrats, because maybe it's the bureaucrats this time who have to save the world.
But there's one thing is bureaucrat and... Oh, could we let that sink in, please? I have never been in a panel where that has been the point of it, but thank you so much. Uffe, Stig, are you still here? Simon, one thing is setting the goals, as you said, and pushing it towards the left side of your scenarios. But there are also some obstacles. Gas, obviously, and old fossil fuels have some advantages for certain industries. What are actually the realistic approach to getting into these sectors where gas today is crucial?
Yeah, like I said, we have a current energy infrastructure that is usually relatively secure, that has been built up to be competitive over many years, and a lot of industries are dependent on natural gas. But we can pick apart the ones that are dependent because they need particularly high temperatures or particular characteristics of fossil fuel combustion, or the chemical nature of natural gas as a reducing agent, from those that just need some heat or some power. And so there is a tendency to call these sectors hard-to-abate sectors and say industry is a hard-to-abate sector or long-distance transport is a hard-to-abate sector. I actually think when you start to unpack that, there are some easy-to-abate parts of the hard-to-abate sectors. And we come to things like heat pumps, which could have great opportunities to provide low, medium temperature heat or heat upgrading in many industries. And for that, policy is going to be absolutely key. And I think the conversation has been pretty intense this year between European governments in terms of how do we incentivize people to take up heat pumps on the residential side, but also the industry side. And then we've seen some innovation. We've seen reduced taxes in some places. We've seen other countries here reducing the tax on the electricity that goes into the heat pumps. So I'm reasonably confident we're going to get much better at deploying things.
How much of this problem is actually about an inertia in the system, about, I wouldn't say laziness, because that would be very unpolite, but perhaps a knowledge gap to what other solutions are actually out there?
Yes, awareness is always going to be helpful, giving people choice, letting folks know that there are alternatives. And I think that's true not only for residential consumers, but also many people running businesses don't have time to research all of their energy options. But I'm not that confident that knowledge is enough on its own. So, another thing that we see governments do is helping to incentivize the intermediaries who can then provide the solutions to folks without them having to learn everything themselves.
Okay, before I get to questions from you, let me just put the point forward to you, Martin Victoria, because again, when you put your slide on how to compose or fill this Russian gas gap, it seemed like there was hard work to be done. Are you as optimistic about the solutions?
I think the challenge is huge, so we have a lot of work ahead of us. I also think we are in a critical point where many people have started to be more sensitive about the energy crisis, and that's also something that we should we should use, and we should that kind of state in which we think about how do we want to get our energy from. That should be useful to make the transition faster. So I don't know if I'm optimistic. I would say that we are in a very critical point. So having this discussion now, all what we can do from now to 2030 is kind of key to see if we can remain in a path compatible to get to 1.5 degrees, or we kind of lose that train, that opportunity, and need to accept.
So I'm giving you now a magic wand.
Yeah.
And with this magic wand, you can remove one obstacle. What would that be?
I will make sure that, if I can remove one obstacle, I will make sure that those who are consuming gas today, those industries, those consumers that are benefiting from that, have a new business radically next to it, to which they can jump. So there's no losers, because that's also something that is happening. This transformation has companies who are losing their business.
Okay, that would require a magic wand, I'd say.
But you gave me one.
But I gave you one. Oh, yeah, true. Scavenius, Ulrik, and please let me know if somebody has some questions for the panel.
So I'm not sharing this optimism, and also I think we need to be aware of there will be losers. There will be companies that have not seen this and have not shifted their technologies at the right time. So they will lose, and also if people invest in it, they will at some point have a lot of stranded assets. Then the question is really, will there be this political shift? And again, we should be pessimistic about that. I don't see I don't know what I can do, at least, or from the Green Party, but the optimism should not be big. But I think the optimism is coming from those who do not have this budget thinking, and also talk about carbon neutrality, because if we look at the budget and look at the target as fossil-free, then we are very pessimistic. So it's also a question of what are we actually dealing with, what is our understanding of the climate challenge. And I think also we should be aware of how we discuss this, because this is not just like a discussion of targets, it's also a discussion of policy design and policy framing. And there's a lot of thinking about where we may on a target level agree, but then on the policy design we disagree, because you believe that market-based solution will be the right way to go. I believe that it's only possible if we have the right political regulation that can make it possible to make this shift that Martha is talking about, because it's not possible within a black economy to shift rapidly enough into this green economy.
But luckily, you are a politician,
Yes.
right? Now, so that is basically the task that is on your
It's on my task.
your table, or the politician at large, at least, and through, of course, larger networks as the European Union. But what do you need in order to make a transition on the scale and at the pace that Simon and Victoria has given us?
As actually, I think I need two things. I need that people, all those who are bureaucrats, experts, they are not that optimistic, that they say what the numbers shows, that they say this is actually, we are not reaching the targets. And today the Climate Council from Denmark also said that we are not in any sense reaching the 1.5 degree target, and I think that should be one really necessary point. The other is that all those who are in the business and make investments, and like the Ulrik Bang, they are aware that they need regulation, because I think there's this left-right ways of understanding politics where all the people on the right, they don't think they need regulation, and therefore they actually work against it. And we have seen a lot of, in the last 20 years, lobbyism against political regulation. And I think that's the key, because what you are actually aiming at, that it requires some political regulation, which I can do, but only if you can see that and also talk to all your friends in the other parties that we actually need that type of regulation. Then we can solve it, so to say.
I guess you will get an answer here, and then we have some question. Would be fair, though. Well, please.
But just on the question of regulation, that's right. We are pro-market, because we believe that we are only solving the climate crisis if it's for profit. It's only if businesses can invest, earn money on delivering green technologies, green solutions, that we will solve the problem. So it's pro-market. That's right. You need to build a business case, and you need to get a rate of return on your investment. How do you create these markets? There you need a lot of regulation. So it's not no to regulation at all. But I think looking at regulation, a lot of the problem we have today is every regulation we have today is based on the past. So whether it's on our food or GMO regulation, pesticides, energy sector, it's built on the past, on a fossil chemical paradigm, so to speak. We have to rewrite regulation for new green solutions. And I think there's not a quick fix. It's a lot of regulation that needs to be rewritten.
In each sector, yeah.
In each sector. But I believe it's for profit. I think that's maybe there we disagree, but for me that's at least key. And just one thing on that business need to see an exit, or that you need to kind of find a solution for the fossil industry to survive. Coming from the business side, it's everyday business that someone is actually going bankrupt. So, and I'm meeting that, talking to my members on, should we subsidize the one who have high energy bills? You have some saying, yes, they need subsidies because you have high energy costs. Others are saying, no, they shouldn't have any subsidies because they didn't invest in energy efficiency. So that's distorting the market. So within the business community, I think that's important. Perhaps we should do that, being more vocal on, it's normal that you have businesses going bankrupt. So this is actually has transformed the whole communication industry, which is good. We don't kind of want to go back to having landline phones, so I think that's just that business is surviving on others' graves, so to speak.
Just to take before I pass the word on the floor, Martha and Simon, your reflections on the push and pull from market versus policies. Do you see it in your models? Do you see what works best? Do you see it in your future outlooks, what works best? A few words on that?
So I can try to answer that question from a modeling perspective. I mentioned that we look at the cost-effective system, so minimize the cost, but we add constraint. For instance, we want to minimize the cost while reducing the CO2. And then how strongly that constraint is affecting the model, we can understand that by how much policy do we need. Because this is what it's making. If we had no constraint, we will have a certain solution. But by adding the constraint saying we need to reduce, or CO2 needs to be lower than that amount, this is what we are kind of representing the policy. And a short answer is yes, we need a lot of policy for that to happen. And more elaborate answer is maybe we don't need that much policy for reducing emission in the electricity sector or for the first step, but we need a lot of policy to keep walking the reduction pathway.
Which is also an answer when we look into the Russian independence question. Simon, do you want to add something? Otherwise, I'll go here.
Yeah, very quick. I mean, I think that by and large, if you put a lot of experts in a room together, energy experts, they'll come out with some variation on what Ulrich said, which is, we need space for the market to play, defined by regulation. It's what is the size of the space in which it's defined by regulation. But let me just say one clear thing relating to the modeling. The modeling, most models sort of bake in an idea of learning curves. Technology gets cheaper as it gets deployed. And we're not representing particular policies, but that's often the outcome of a process of trial and error, investment, people going bust, people having better solutions, people coming into the market. And so we've got a tension at the moment that we see clearly, and we're slightly worried about, between the need for innovation, the need to drive down costs, and also increasing protectionism. Increasing, we're not just talking about competition between businesses, but competition between regional blocks. And actually, if we want to get lowest cost, cheapest trade is, and open markets are the best way to do that.
And before we enter into the big Biden-Macron question about American policies, I will go here.
This is basically a question or a challenge to Ulrike and Teresa. If you were given 1 year, let me say one thing first. If you look at all the technologies that are out there, in the lab, pilot scale, all that we already have, you can only be an optimist. We can do it. I mean, that hockey stick, we're already there, technology-wise. Yes, we can do it. Now, you are given 1 year to put together the regulation and the market shaping and everything that needs to be in place for these technologies to take off. Can you do that? Because it's really long, from my point of view, this is not a technology issue. We can do it. Be it agriculture, food, energy, we can do it. But without that mechanism of regulation and markets, it's not going to happen. So you have 1 year to do it.
Okay, so we'll meet in a year. Like, what happened?
What happened? So I think, first of all, I'll be structured in the approach, looking at different sectors, different regulatory regimes. That's one thing, and because it's a different regulatory setup within food or agricultural inputs or energy. So I think that's first of all. I think one key thing overarching every sector is what Simon is mentioning. So how do you frame the market? So that is putting a high cost on carbon. Because that's key, and that's key for business, is that if you know that if you have a cost on carbon, that you'll try to invent solutions to mitigate it. So I think that's one key thing overarching. Secondly, I would look at some of the easy fixes, also being a little bit populistic, looking at energy, saying how can we get lower energy bills, and that's actually the same as having more renewables. So how can you have massive deployment of renewables? In Denmark, we are fortunate with a lot of wind, a little bit of solar. So how can you do that on rooftops, on land, and on sea? And that is kind of having a SWAT team on removing regulatory barriers. I would say not 1 year, but 100 days, because that's kind of, new government, 100 days action plan. What can you do?
Sounds like these things has been written down and given to some people who's right now negotiating, or...
I don't know, but I would be happy if they listen.
Teresa?
So in theory, I just need 1 day, because what I think is the right answer is really that we need an updated climate law. It should be based on the budget thinking. So if we got this budget thinking in, then we can see how much do we need to do today, next year, and if we have make that effective law, then all the other guys in all these sectors and different resort ministers can then translate that into different sector-specific regulation. And I think we should think like a corona politics, where they in the parliament they decided to say, okay, we are closing down the society, and then afterwards everybody find out, okay, at my companies we should do this, and in other companies they did that. So it's really about saying from the central position, it's really a easy politics, and therefore I also think the opposition between the market and state is really, really fraught, because we are in a state-based policy designed market. And I think that's the challenge in the competitive state, is really that people cannot see anymore all the regulation, all the politics that have created this society. So this is not either or, this is about different roles, and I think a lot of the politicians have forgotten to be policymakers, and then the business should just do what they're doing really well, because we have obviously a regulated market economy, and that's also what I stand for, obviously. So we should have all the markets finding out how to do it on the ground level, but we need this central law in order to make this push really happen.
And on that term, we came from being optimistic in 250, 230, being optimistic in 100 days, to simply being optimistic about tomorrow ain't that Now there's a coffee break now, there's snacks, it's downstairs, and we'll start 10 minutes over. Okay, are we ready? It's a wonderful sign for every conference that it's very difficult to get people back from the break. Hold da kæft. Friends, I love that I hate to interrupt you, but I love the level of discussion that is going on right now. Alfred, isn't that exactly what we want to have today? A lot of discussion, and there'll be possibilities after this as well. Now, we're going into the second phase of this CORC Forum, and now we're going into the juicy stuff and taking a deep dive on technology. And as I was preparing for this event, I was like, okay, could we just collaboratively together think what actually happened the last year? Like, yes, Ukraine was invaded. Yes, the Nord Stream pipes in the in the Baltic Sea, not in the North Sea, have been destroyed by explosions. The toughest sanctions we've ever seen have been imposed on Russia. Now, this is the picture that we're talking into when we are talking about alternatives to gas. And somebody was kind enough to remind me that I didn't introduce myself. I won't do it long. Just say that my name is Ida Ebbensgaard, and I am a journalist, and I've been working with climate and energy for a couple of decades, actually, and being an editor-in-chief and hosting a lot of programs on television and radio. I won't bore you with that part of it because I would much rather like to introduce another person, Bruce Logan. And to those of you who don't know Bruce yet, let me give you a good introduction to him. Now, obviously, he is a world-leading expert on green hydrogen and methane gases. You are a PhD from the University of California in Berkeley. You have been at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And now you're at the Penn State University, where you're the director of the Institute of Energy and the Environment. And Bruce is an active gentleman. Not only is he here today and has just published a book, which he talked about yesterday here in Copenhagen, he's also a busy researcher, and he has published more than 500 articles. So when we are talking about scale, this is also a scale. And now, for the keynote speaker for today, please, Bruce Logan.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. So my job is to give a technical talk without giving a technical talk. Sounds pretty easy. So what I'd like to do is sort of paint the picture and give you a vision into an alternative way to make or to capture energy to make fuels. So here's my opening slide. You can see some little things up there, but let me recap what Alfred Sporman said. There are a few different ways that we can produce gas. In Denmark, about 80% of the natural gas is due to fossil gas. About 20% is already due to biomethane production. Then there are two other ways that we can make that gas. One is, and they both use renewable electricity. One would be to use inorganic systems, catalysts, and to chemically manufacture that gas. And the other way is to use nature, is to use microorganisms that can actually turn electricity into methane. Now that sounds pretty crazy. It's a little bit like science fiction, but there are microorganisms that can eat food and make electricity. We call them electrogens. And there are microorganisms that can accept electrons and make valuable products. We call those electrotrophs. Electrogens generate, electrotrophs loving electricity. And this occurs in nature. We call it interspecies electron transfer, where one microorganisms give electrons to another microorganism. In the engineering world, we call these bioelectrochemical systems because they have to do with microorganisms that are on electrodes, think batteries, positive and negative, anode and cathode, where these organisms can sit on these electrodes. Now, this is not something rare in the world of microorganisms. In fact, all three domains of life, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, or eukarya, can certain organisms can release those electrons. So when we eat food, we're basically oxidizing organic matter, and then we send it through a series of chemicals, and then when we're done with it, we give it to oxygen. Oxygen is our electron acceptor, so we do this. Now, if we don't eat for a while, we do okay. But if we don't get rid of those electrons, that is, we don't breathe, it's a very short life. So there's different challenges with each side of this. Now, the microorganisms that can accept electrons are only two classes, the bacteria and the archaea. No eukarya can do that. And so these are the microorganisms that we want to use in engineered systems. So these engineered systems have two electrodes, like a battery, an anode and a cathode. You can have microorganisms on the anode creating that electrical current. You can have microorganisms on the cathode accepting that. So if there are microbes on any one of those, either of those electrodes, it's a bioelectrochemical system. There can also be power put into the system, or the system can spontaneously generate electricity. And there may be membranes or separators between those electrodes, much like we have in batteries and fuel cells. So in these systems where we're trying to make products from the cathode, which is mostly my talk today, those electrons do eventually have to go to something. They come off that electrode, they can go to oxygen, they can go to different chemicals like nitrate or soluble metals and plate out those metals. They can reduce CO2 to organic compounds, and today, talking mostly about being able to send those over to make methane. So the electrochemical systems then are a big general term. The technologies, the things that we're actually going to build to make products, those are called microbial electrochemical technologies, METs. And I'll break them down into two types of systems. The first system is where these bacteria send these electrons over to oxygen, like in a hydrogen fuel cell. That makes electricity. The product is electricity. The second system is where the bacteria send those electrons over, and there's no oxygen, but we add a little voltage into there, and now we can make hydrogen. So it's a way to turn organic matter into hydrogen using microorganisms. And then the third one is where we can have many things happening at the anode, but at the cathode here, we're taking that CO2 in and we're forming organic products. We're using the energy in the circuit and CO2, we're reusing that CO2 to make methane. So there are a couple different ways that we can envision how this system works. The first is that we have an anaerobic digester, which is already, like I said, producing about 20% of the biogas here. And we can take that system and actually use this microbial electrolysis cell to make hydrogen and then inject it into these anaerobic digesters. The other thing, so in one system, we're just going to make hydrogen and put it in there. We're going to make hydrogen with oxygen. And the other one, we don't need to have the digester. We just have a source of electricity and CO2, and we make methane. Now, we can do that with the CO2 and anaerobic digestion. So if we have an anaerobic digester that's producing methane and CO2, that's our CO2 source. And it's there, it's waiting for us to use. We take that and we simply use that and some electricity and we add it into that gas stream that we have there, and we could conceivably double the amount of methane being produced. So to go from 20% to 40% just by adding these systems to the existing anaerobic digester infrastructure. So how are we going to do this? Okay, this is where it gets a little more technical. More technical. This is where it gets a little more technical, but just paint a vision on how we might get there, okay? So the first is we have to know what the microbes are. So we go out, we get rich sources of microbes. This is a bog. We have anaerobic digesters, and we put them in these little reactors in our lab, and we try and figure out what they are, what they're doing. And this is what the lab looks like. There are microbes in there somewhere, I'm telling you. But it's mostly wires and bottles, really. So we take those, and then we look at what we started with, and these are a whole range of different microbes. These are archaea. And you can see that these are open colored bars, and then the ones here are all black. And that means that all those bacteria are mostly this one, this methanobacterium. So we do all these, we get these different sources, we put them in there, and we add electricity, and we seem to get this one bacterium, microorganism, methanobacterium. Okay. So now we change the electrode materials, because that's one of the things we want to know is what's the best materials to put in this system to make it work. And we use all these different things down here, metals and minerals. We use different types of carbon. And we go from this starting material, it's red, right? So much different than all this. But again, all black bars here, it's all these methanobacterium. Except for one case that's really notable here. And that's where we put platinum on the electrode to catalyze hydrogen evolution. And when we do that, we get a different microorganism out of here. So how we catalyze, maybe if we catalyze with the microbes themselves, or if we add in a hydrogen evolution catalyst, we get a different result. That's, for us, a little challenge, because now we're not so sure what the best way to approach the problem is. It's very clear that these microorganisms are responsible for making methane, and that they can do it abiotically, that is, with no, without hydrogen evolution. This is, if we apply that, if we apply some power to the system, we don't see any hydrogen, we don't get any methane. If we put the microbes in there, you see the methane shooting up. That means that they're making it work. And so if we take the microbe that we've had in the freezer that's supposedly exactly like the microbe that's in nature, and we do that again, we don't get much from that microbe kept in the freezer. These natural ones seem to have abilities to do this much better. So these wild type microorganisms seem to have properties that may have been sort of bred out in the organisms we keep in our laboratory. Now, we need to know how the best way to design the system to get those electrons. So one thing we say, well, are bacteria needed on this electrode to be intermediaries to these methanogens? Those are the ones that are making the methane. Or is it just the methanogens that need to be there? And we don't need these bacteria, but we deal with mixed cultures, so we're not really sure if we need them or not. So we do some experiments, we test all different types of materials, we make many of these reactors, we look at how the methane evolves, and we see something here which is, this blue bar is how much methane we get if it's being made by hydrogen. And when we use platinum over many cycles, these bars are about the same height as this one, which means that the platinum catalyst is clearly making hydrogen. That hydrogen is clearly being turned into methane. In all these other cases, these bars are very low, and these microorganisms are accepting those electrons. And so we know that if we catalyze it, we're going to make hydrogen. It's a different route. So that's saying, well, maybe we want to optimize hydrogen, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So this, in that experiment, gave us the highest rate. So we know this occurs for sure. These other ones, we're not really sure about how prevalent they are in the systems, but we know if we make hydrogen, we're going to get a lot of those microbes. Okay, so we've said we can look at these different materials. We've said that we're going to get one or two different microorganisms. Those are the ones that are important. Now, how are we going to use that to make a system? And by the way, in engineering, when you make a system, there's three words: better, faster, cheaper. You don't get all three. So We've looked at scaling these up. I won't go into the details of this, but little reactors to bigger reactors to bigger reactors, and we've gotten, in the case of making electricity, we can turn organic matter. This is about 1,000 liters or about a cubic meter. We know we can do it, although the amount of electricity we produce is low. The same thing with making hydrogen in these systems. We've started with little reactors, made them progressively bigger. When we went to this 1,000-liter reactor, we actually found we didn't get any hydrogen, we got methane. So actually, we've known how to turn organic matter into methane in these reactors for quite some time, but we haven't necessarily done it cheaper or faster or better. So we know we can do it. If we want hydrogen, we have to keep the hydrogen away from the methanogens, because the second the methanogens get it, they're going to make methane. And in fact, in this one reactor that we ran, this was sort of the energy we put in here, and this was the energy out. We got about 16 times more energy in the methane we got out than the electricity we put in. So we know if we take these electrodes, put them in an anaerobic digester, we're going to get out a lot of energy. A lot of it's just the anaerobic digestion, though. So the question is, do we get more energy out when we stick the electrodes in or not? There's still some discussion, but it's clear if we put them in, we get more methane and it comes out faster. Now, that finally brings us to the real subject of this talk, which is electrosynthesis. So in these other cases, we've had organic matter sort of being involved in the system. Now we want to say, okay, we can get that 20% more methane from an anaerobic digester by, converting organic matter into to methane. But how do we now just make methane whenever we want it using electricity? To do that, we have to scale up the system and we have to split water at the anode. So water splitting like you'd have in a hydrogen generation system. And we've gone from these little bottles to bigger bottles to these things that work best in our laboratory, which are these big carbon fiber brushes. It works great, but it's too big and it doesn't produce hydrogen fast enough. So what we've done is to develop these very small reactors, very thin. Now, in the previous one here, you have, in the previous one here, you have this chamber. It's kind of wide because it accommodates this brush with which a lot of microorganisms grow on. But the reactor's too big. So take the width of this chamber now, and we replace it with this tiny sliver of a chamber. And because we keep these electrodes very close, we don't lose a lot of power that we're putting in there to just heat and wasted energy. Now we start to really make use of that, and we make it much more efficient, much more compact, and we can generate methane much faster. So just looking inside, it's basically a couple of pieces of carbon felt, some pieces of plastic for space in the reactor to move through. And you have this little pair which basically looks like the spacers, but now we can stack these up together like a hydrogen fuel cell, for example, a hydrogen fuel cell stack. To compare how efficient we've gotten from these old bottle systems to this reactor, we've lowered the internal resistance, which means that the energy we're wasting only a tenth of what we were before. So we've improved the reactor by a factor of 10. And instead of methane production rates of about 0.0062 liters per liter of methane per liter of reactor per day, we're now at about 3 liters per liter per day and a current density of about approaching 20 amps per meter squared. That number doesn't necessarily mean anything to you. But let's take a look at now what this is looking like it's costing. And I don't know, I wasn't aware of what electricity cost here when I was putting together this slide. So I kind of used European averages. But going off of that basis of, say, 30.3 euros per kilowatt hour, and looking at what the natural gas might cost at a home, and then what the electricity cost would be to make this methane. The electricity costs are pretty similar. So, you know, if I look at the cost of electricity in your home, the cost of electricity and the cost of natural gas for your home, the cost of the natural gas based on that electricity is reasonable. And this is just the first generation shot right now. It's not a final product. I don't want to be held to that. But for perspective, you know, a cubic meter of natural gas is about the same energy of about a little over a liter of gasoline. And when you look to turn that energy into electricity, into methane, there's an efficiency. It's never going to be 100%, which means you're going to lose it. When you turn split water and you make hydrogen, there's an efficiency there. And the same way here, there's an efficiency. Currently, it's about 15 to 20%, but of course, the whole thing of research is we're going to improve that. We're going to make that better. For comparison, turning methane into electricity is about 33 to 65% efficient, just to put that in perspective. So, you know, 50% efficiencies are kind of the name of the game here. So very quickly, future directions, you know, where are we going on this? Well, we have some options here. I told you one way that they can do this is by first catalyzing hydrogen production, whether that also catalyzes the uptake of electrons to the microbes, or it just makes hydrogen and they use that hydrogen. We don't really know, but if we put a good catalyst on here, and we have not used that in some of these experiments, we might be able to do that. When we put a catalyst on, as we drive this up, we also get some other things, but primarily if we were generating hydrogen, we might need to make sure we had enough time to take that hydrogen up. And so just to take a step back and to say, what if we just make hydrogen in the digesters first? Well, actually, we can make hydrogen much faster than we can methane right now. And so we could make hydrogen pretty efficiently in these reactors. And these are just a bunch of different studies where people have done this. Our system works the best. We're at about 70 liters per liter per day of hydrogen, which translates to about 20 liters per liter per day for methane. So we can take microbial electrolysis cells, we can make hydrogen, and we can add that into digesters. If we use microbial electrosynthesis and we generate hydrogen, we also, in mixed cultures, generate some other things, volatile fatty acids, but the methanogens can, by and large, use these as well and make more methane. So we may have a system as we turn electricity into methane where we make some other things, some organics, but ultimately by adding a little fixed bed sort of reaction vessel post there, we could turn that into methane. So in the end, we can get pretty specific product even with all these different microorganisms using electricity in these systems. The other one is the catalyst for making hydrogen, and we use platinum in our early experiments. Platinum's not sustainable. It's expensive. We don't want to use that. But we've been doing some recent work with alternative catalysts because there's a lot of science out there in the field. We've used things like stainless steel, which has a high nickel content. Nickel is a real critical element of catalyzing hydrogen evolution if you're not going to use platinum. And we've tested a couple of different new nickel molybdenum materials. And this just shows you, here's platinum, okay? This red line is our replacement for platinum, and it's close to platinum. That's all you really need to see from that graph. It's close to platinum, okay? And that means that we'll get platinum-like performance without having to use an expensive catalyst. So we think that we can catalyze that cathode to increase methane production rates and therefore make a much better system. What will this look like in the future? I don't know. This was our reactor that we made. We put this on wastewater and we made methane instead of hydrogen. this is our new compact reactor, and what we have to do is think about how to turn this slab here into basically a series of modules that we slide into this big tank. We flip that switch, turn on the electricity, and out bubbles methane. Perfect. Okay, so one caution, last caution. I'm a responsible scientist. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So let us remember, while we're talking about using natural gas, biogas, syngas, and everything else, that we can't let it escape. That's good economics because you don't want to lose the product you're making. But the fact is that it's about 25 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2, and that's based on a 100-year lifetime definition, which most climate scientists now are saying it's not 100 years. You need to be using 20 years, and if you do that, it's 85 times. So a little bit that escapes will quickly ruin anything that you've done by repurposing CO2. So let's just remember to do that while we go forward and figure out how to do this. And so I just wanted to conclude, and I wanted to note a couple of researchers in my lab, Ruggiero Rossi, who's moving to Johns Hopkins University, who's done a lot of this very compact reactor work, and Dr. Guyon Beck, who did this state-of-the-art microbial electrosynthesis work that has shown us that we can really get there. Thank you very much.
Do you remember when Martha Victoria said that this was the only equation you would see? Now, this was your little chemistry lesson. Bruce, what an eye-opening speech you gave here. Why is this technology not everywhere?
You know, we discovered this process, I think back in 2009, and we ran into some problems. Methane was incredibly cheap, and so cheap for the foreseeable future, nobody would ever want to turn electricity into cheap methane. My, how the times have changed. That's the primary reason. So the technologies for making electricity or for making hydrogen move forward, and this one lagged. And it's only been very recently that people have started to say, we need to find easier ways and cheaper ways to make methane. So it's really just been a resurgence in the last year or two.
And more energy secure ways to produce it. Now, you said you're on a pilot scale. What would it take to bring you to a different level?
Well, I think a pilot scale for this technology is still the next step because we need to figure out a few more things before we go to that really big scale. We can learn a lot from test tubes and tiny little reactors, but when you get to things that are this big versus this big in the electricity world, that makes a really big difference because you start losing a lot of your energy. And so we need to figure out how to do that the most effectively we can. And this catalyst idea and this idea of very compact systems, I think, opens the door to building that next reactor so we can then take it to the next level.
And who's helping you on this way?
Well, I'm hoping you will. We have a little bit of seriously internal funding for this right now, and we're looking to have the Carbon Reuse Center give us funding to do this. You know, but every single scientist will tell you, oh, if I had 10 or 20 people working on this, you'd have it 10 or 20 times faster. So that's, you know, that's just what we say. It's true, by the way.
Going back to the technology itself, you start with hydrogen, or you come to the point of hydrogen, and then you end with methane, right? Mm-hmm. Why do the last part of the process? Why not stop with hydrogen and say, okay, hydrogen would also be a great way to get into a carbon neutral economy?
Yeah, well, I also do a lot of work in hydrogen, and I think hydrogen is a great chemical product. It's got more energy essentially than methane because methane spontaneously gets, hydrogen can be turned into methane. It's a spontaneous process. But you can only inject a very small amount of hydrogen into a natural gas pipeline, and you have to do some very special things to handle and compress hydrogen. And even if you try and use hydrogen in gas turbines, you have to make special changes in those gas turbines. So there's just a lot of reasons why the very expensive infrastructure we've built is not ready to be turned off and simply switch to hydrogen. We can do that, but we have to phase it in, and that's really the key.
Keeping the infrastructure. Questions? Oh, who has a question? Please. You know the drill. Wait for the microphone. And please, other questions are very welcome.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. 2 questions. Do you think this could downscale the need for electrolysis plants? Also, from what I see, the materials going in there will probably be cheaper. And the second question, what is the Faraday efficiency?
So the first question is, will it decrease the need for water electrolyzers? Absolutely not. I mean, we need energy storage and we need transportable fuel so much that we have to go get like gangbusters in both of these. The Faradaic efficiencies can be pretty high. We don't lose a lot of the current that we're making. I mean, we lose energy relative to heat and internal resistance losses and so forth. But once we have the electrons in the circuit, we do a pretty good job at recovering those. Generally 90–95%.
So there's a pretty large potential for improvement in efficiency there.
The energy efficiency is what we are working on, and the rates, because we want to make these reactors produce methane at much greater volumes per volume of reactor. That's really what we're after.
We don't hear. Could you introduce yourself when you pose a question, sir?
Yes, so really nice talk. My name is Bjarke Christensen. I come from DTU Bioengineering. My question is actually, I mean, so you have done a lot of optimization on the processing side as far as I can see it, but what about the microorganisms that you are using? I mean, how much have you been optimizing on that side? I mean, and how much is there actually to gain on that if you really start to work on them?
Well, this is the subject of some work that we're trying to do with Alfred Sporman's group. You know, in terms of what are the best microbes, we know we have a lot of confidence in what shows up to the dance, shall we say, under a catalyzed or a non-catalyzed electrode. But that's a different thing than saying what can function in this engineered system most efficiently under the conditions we have. And we haven't done much work in that area. We tend to work with the microbes that we can thaw out and put into action. That's probably not the best strategy here, but there's still a lot to be learned from it.
I can feel the coffee pouring up in some cups around here. Any further questions right now for Bruce? Otherwise, you will join the panel afterwards.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Bruce Logan. And now we are moving on to a company that has been on my mind, and I would guess on perhaps every Dane's in this room's mind in the last week, Nature Energy, because you have just had a great news to the world that you've been acquired by Shell, and congratulations, I should start by saying.
Thank you.
Søren Holm, you're the CTO of Nature Energy.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you. Just need the PowerPoint here. Yeah, and thanks for that opening, Ida. And I actually wanted to, I already got that question twice in the coffee room. Let me just see if I can, and that's why I basically talked about the elephant in the room. I know it's on many Danes' mind. First of all, talking to the topic on how to scale biogas, this is from a Nature Energy perspective a true acknowledgement that we have reached the level of scaling that makes us interesting for the big energy producing companies. Secondly, part of the press release, Shell has pointed out that they plan on using our platform to grow further on the biogas industry worldwide. They have activities in North America, but very little in Europe, and they want to use our platform to further grow that. So again, double-sided positive in our world. We see this as business as usual, short term, but higher ambitions on both the growth and technology side, medium to long term. So a very positive development in our perspective. Sliding slowly into the topic of scaling biogas, I just want to reach out and say that again, from our perspective, we see these three different sources of renewable energy. We have the sun, the wind, and the bio-waste. We do not see these three energy forms as competing. We see these as complementing, and as Bruce just said, we basically need full throttle on all levers here to reach our target. So just want to have that out. I'll come back slightly to where we see one of the supplements. Nature Energy's focus on biogas started back in 2014 with 5 people sitting in a corner looking into biogas. They had to answer a few questions to really get traction on this. The first was, what is the potential in this? Is there really a potential to make us relevant in the market? So first off, they started looking at biomasses, so organic waste, and looking at the availability in society. Zooming in on Denmark as the home market, basically realized that there's enough organic waste to put a industrial scale biogas plant for every 50 kilometers in Denmark, just from a organic waste perspective. Taking the same measurement and putting that outside Denmark, this actually puts the perspective that there's room for 2,000 industrial scale sized biogas plants in Europe, the same in North America, and up to 7,000 biogas plants in Southeast Asia. Comparable, we are the world's largest biogas producer, and we have 14 plants, just to put it in perspective. So the potential from an organic waste perspective is enormous. That organic waste needs to be treated. We believe that biogas is a good way to handle that. Biomass is one thing. What about the methane, the gas that we produce? Is there actually a good use of that? Taking a bit further perspective, these are 2020 numbers. I think they coincide with Simon's numbers, that the amount of imported Russian natural gas in 2020 is 155 billion cubic meters of methane. Again, to put into perspective, in Europe, the biogas or the biological methane produced in the same period was in the neighborhood of 3 billion cubic meters. So there is a lot of room or a lot of opportunity to improve that. And the Repower EU that was talked about earlier has set an ambition of 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane by 2030. So the ambitions are there. We believe that the ambitions can be even higher than 35, but it's a good place to start. It's tenfold where we are today. So a very good place to start. So that kind of talks to the relevance of biogas, right? There's plenty of biomasses, organic waste. There's plenty of demand for biomethane in the world. So how do we approach the scaling? I'm going to go back to 2014 again. At that point in time, biogas was a very simple installation. It was basically or mainly farm-based. So a small biogas facility at a specific farm that where the main purpose was for heating or for generating electricity through a gas motor. So rather inefficient with a low to moderate CO2 abatement. It was a simple installation with a very localized focus area. We have worked diligently to take this to what we call biogas 2.0, to basically industrialize biogas. So taking the size of biogas installations at least tenfold, because size does matter here. If we need the unit cost to go down to a sustainable level. So that's one level that we've taken up scale. We've sized it differently, and we have the number here in gigawatt hours. But a typical Nature Energy biogas plant has 20 million cubic meters of gas, and we have 500,000 tons of biomasses a year that we handle in a plant. We've also applied what we call a co-digestion model. So allowing that we both use manure from agriculture, or we use deep litter, we use industrial waste from slaughterhouses, from the milk industry, and we use household waste as well. So blending all of this together in a digester and degassing it. So that's another part of scaling it to be relevant. And we do apply what we refer to as best available technology. So continuously putting the best available technology and focusing very much on the CO2 abatement. We talked about methane, or Bruce talked about methane slippage in our world, right? To bring that down to an absolute minimum. That is one of our key focus areas in design and operation. Our ambitions doesn't stop there, though. We have a tangible plan going towards what we call biogas 3.0. There's still some scale to gain. We will make our plants larger again. There is a limit to this because biomass also needs to be transported. Right, so that's one of the limits we normally have on our biomasses, that we try to not have transportation more than 25 kilometers. There are some high yield biomasses that we transport longer, but the basis is a short distance transporting, again to focus on the CO2 footprint. But what we much more look into here in the biogas 3.0, that's technology. That we get better utilization of carbon. I'll come back to that in a moment. We also open up for new types of biomasses that is considered fully waste today, that we can actually utilize them in creating methane on this, and basically focusing on waste and residue feedstocks. So going more and more towards that if this organic matter can be used with a better intent somewhere else, then it should be used there. So focusing on waste and residues more and more for the greater good. Before going into the technology, I just want to have one more advantage of the biogas industry as we see it, and that's the circular element. Because all of this biomass that we have now degassed, that becomes green fertilizer. So we operate on an exchange model, as we call it, with the farmers that we get all their waste, we degas it, and we bring it back as a green fertilizer. So so basically for allowing them to grow tomorrow's crops, the food for next year. So there's a recycling of nutrition in this that's very keen to us. We spend a lot of R&D efforts in optimizing that towards the soil health. The upside of this is that this offsets chemical or synthetic fertilizer that the farmers would need to buy elsewhere. So there's also a CO2 offsetting there that we don't calculate with currently, but it is a benefit to the overall society. We have a lot of focus on the organic farming because they cannot use synthetic fertilizer to the same degree. So there's a great focus on that in our model. And this brings me to the deepest technology slide that I have. This is a very simplified picture of the carbon mass balance that we look into. And again, the easy part of it is the left-hand side, right? We have 100% carbon in with the biomasses. And a traditional biogas plant only utilizes 36% of that carbon. That's a fairly low efficiency, if you can say that. So how do we get to the 36%? It's basically because 60% of the carbon goes into the raw biogas, and as I think Alfred showed in the beginning, only 60% of that raw biogas is methane. So that's 36%. We have again a tangible plan coming back to the biogas 3.0 that builds upon getting to 90% carbon utilization in our facilities. We actually have a high technology readiness level to get there. We also have a phase 2 and a phase 3 coming up to get better efficiency in it, right? We also what you talked to Bruce, we're looking into some of the same technologies on how to get there cheaper, better, faster. But the obvious place to start is with the CO2. right? That's 24% of the carbon that traditionally just let out of the chimney. So why are we not doing anything about that, some would ask. But we are. We have one facility where we actually have the CCU. We capture the CO2, we cleanse it, and we distribute it to the Danish beverage industry through a partner. And that one facility, at the time of commissioning, covered approximately 40% of the Danish beverage industry's CO2 usage. Again, just to put it in scale. We do have other avenues. We are also working on carbon capture storage projects to validate that technology within biogas. And we also have our own version of Power-to-X coming up, which will be in operation full scale next year. We talk about scale. We had a 1 cubic meter reactor running for 500 days to learn it deeply, how we could turn it on, turn it off, because it's highly dependent on energy prices to be relevant. And we're now scaling it up to 400 cubic meters reactors, which we will have, as mentioned, in production next year. That's basically it's very simplified, taking green hydrogen, mixing it in a biological process with our CO2, and then creating e-methane. Increasing the methane percentage from 60 to 98%. That's the key of it. We do a lot on the back end as well, just to round up what we call basically from the right of the biogas. That's the digestate that we're also looking into. How can we make focused fertilizer for the farming community, or how can we utilize fibers to replace peat, because peat is also rather CO2 intensive when you dig it out of wetlands. So that's also one of our focus areas from an R&D perspective. I just got the 2-minute warning, so I'll basically use that as my closing, and just the picture of our CORC site, where the white columns is actually our CO2 capture and storage for the beverage utilization.
And since we are going into the panel where you are also a part of it, I think actually we should just invite the panel to come up here, which is Bruce Logan. If you come up here, then I'll introduce you afterwards. Yeah.
Hopefully gerne.
Du har dem. Kom over, Christian.
Det er Marie.
Let's go.
Maries.
Okay, now you know two already, and Marie Bjerre is from Venstre, Member of Parliament, and Venstre is like the Liberal Party. And congratulations with the elections, you should say here. And Christian Ibsen, CEO of the green think tank Consider. So welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
Also spent decades in these themes, so a warm welcome. And right now we're going to talk about how to mature technologies, how to take, because we have like a scope here, right? From Bruce, who is sitting here and looking out and saying, okay, we need some scale, you have an exciting technology, to Søren, who just, or you haven't got the billions running yet, but March 23, they will be delivered to you if everything goes as planned. So how do we make this transition? And that'll be the focus for today. So let's just jump into it. And then Søren, now you had the word, so I think we should start with you. If you should look at the obstacles and the possibilities going forward from here, how do you get into a regime where you are non-reliant on Russian gas? What's to get to that scale that you showed yourself?
We have scales from two perspectives. That's what we call land grabbing, building big scale biogas plants. That's one lever to get to there, and the other one is technology to improve the efficiency of those plants. If we look at the market growth, then we do struggle with a couple of things. One being approvals. I do agree that there needs to be certain things to take into consideration, so it's not because I want to break that, it just takes time. There's the NIMBY effect, of course.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah, not in my backyard, sorry, that affects that as well. But there's also the clarity and the outlook. Right? We invest between 50 and 100 million euro in capex in a biogas facility, depending on size and technology. And our investors, they need at least medium term, but preferably long-term outlook in order to put down that kind of money. So whenever legislation is about to change, that creates hesitance with investors. When it has changed, we will adapt fairly quick. But when the process so take the CO2 discussions, not only in Denmark but across Europe, that creates some turmoil among investors. Right? We will navigate, we will settle, but it just creates a lag in decisions. So that's one thing. When it comes to technology, I think we're on a really good path. There are a lot of focus, a lot of interest, and the collaboration, I have never seen it bigger. So we have great collaborations with other industrial partners, with universities and different agencies. So I don't see that as an obstacle. There's just a maturity stage we need to take. So from our perspective, the most in is the insecurity in what will be the business case the next 10 years.
And now you're in a good place with new investors and Shell and the acquisition, obviously. But what has it been to be in that process leading to that big buyout?
First of all, we've been lucky to have owners by equity funds since 2018, right, which has invested a lot of money in our growth, again, both from a technology and market position. So the challenge for us now, while there's also becoming a change in ownership, is that we need to take that up a step. And again, the clarity, the outlook is also the offtake, right? So what bottom line will a biogas facility bring to any investor, right? So teaming up with a company like Shell makes this easier because they have a huge portfolio for offtake. So they can create that security for us in order to have a long-term investment plans.
Bruce, I mean, there's your technology, but I'm sure you know others who are in the same situation like you, with a great, perhaps not as good, but almost as good, with a great idea, but still there's obstacles and there's a gap. How do you get best behind that gap, past that gap?
Every investor wants to, this is his area, I mean, every investor that I've ever talked to, or anybody that wants to help to provide funding to launch a technology, says, what's it going to cost? And so what we usually say is, well, we need to figure out A, B, and C. And then they say, well, we don't want to wait that long, or come back when you figured that out. And so I think, the short of it is for us to really laser focus on those issues which are really critical, where you can then really push it forward fast because you can gather the capital and the support of investors to move it forward. And that's, it sounds easy. Oh yeah, just know it's this or that. But sometimes it's not that easy. So from our perspective, if we can just figure that out, that will help it grow it to the next stage. Then once it hits there, you don't want a university professor running a business.
I'm sure there'll be a chair for you somewhere,
So we just need to get it to that point where other people can take it over.
Marie, that sounds like politicians really have a role here, right?
I believe politicians have a big role. I believe university scientists, the market has a big role as well. And it's not that easy an answer to question to answer. I think the most important task for us politicians are to create the legal framework that makes it easy for the companies to work, that makes the green transition market-driven, because as you said before, Bruce, we need it better, faster, and cheaper. I think you added saying that it's impossible to get it all, but we have to try to create that legal framework where the green transition is market-driven, thereby meaning that it's cheaper if you produce green. We have come a little way, but there's a long way to go still. And of course, it's also about research and development. This is very costly. There are many technologies that we don't know yet or need scale. I think we need political...
do we invest enough in a little but science-driven country like Denmark? Do we invest enough in research and development? Or even demonstration?
Well, it's going better because we have set a political goal that we want to invest more specifically in green transition. Is it enough? That's a good question. We would like that companies would invest as well. It's not only the state, it's not only taxpayers' money, but it's the businesses as well. My party has suggested that we have a tax reduction for companies investing in those new green technologies.
When you consider the subsidizing scheme, which obviously has been very important for Søren Holm's company and other technologies in both Denmark and other places in Europe, what criteria are important to you in order to give subsidies?
It's important that this has an impact, that this is something that helps reducing CO2 emissions, that it's so thereby getting rid of fossil fuel instead of.
Concito. Now you must, Christian, you must have some ideas about how to get this moving into another pace.
Well, I think what has been really interesting this morning is this kind of mutual sense of urgency across the board. I mean, from the IEA, even looking at promising developments to technologies that are even closer to markets or at markets and promising technologies. But I do think that the scale of what we need to do in terms of ambition and speedy implementation is really huge. In Denmark, we're talking about a lot about that at the moment. And that also has to do with speeding up what works now, but still focusing also on developing what might be there for the future. But from a climate perspective, it's also really important to use the resources that we have efficiently. The wind that we have at the moment is not sufficient to do anything what we really need to do in the future. Direct electrification is the primary answer to that use, but also when we don't use it, electricity to use something else like green hydrogen might not be something for Denmark to use, but we might export it to Germany for steel or whatever, fertilizers also. Prioritizing that, prioritizing what to do with the CO2 that we extract from capturing. Storing it is a very good use and the best use for climate, but you can also do other stuff. But the necessity to kind of prioritize is something that we are not very good at in Denmark. We do not need to pick the winners always, and I get that from Maria also, but anything that we develop in the future, I think needs to compete on a level playing field in terms of what climate benefits are there. I know, Søren, that you have used a lot of time in reducing leakage from your facilities, but level playing field, so we don't choose all the different technologies that we are developing, and there's a lot going on, but level playing fields, but also we know there will be high carbon price. So those two needs to be the key function of anything we do. So everybody needs to compete on delivering most climate on these issues, or energy system services, or whatever it is. But I think that we need sometimes in Denmark, we also are not very good at focusing or prioritizing now to get the implementation done. It's important for climate to directly electrify where possible first. Then we can use it for something else.
But when you say that speed is crucial, obviously, I guess this is also a conclusion from the room today, then you have speed on one hand, and then...
Magnitude.
No, but what you say is also like, let's be sure that we do the right thing. Now, these two things, speed and doing the right thing, can sometimes collide, and there is a risk of taking picking some solutions which seems to be right at the time when you picked it, but further down the road,
and sometimes we are not really good at sending the right signal to the market of what is the priorities in the market. For example, when we do get a lot of wind in from the North Sea for hopefully soon, it should be a clear signal that first and foremost it's about electrifying where possible in the heat system, in our transport and so on. But there will be a lot of times where we need to do some other stuff with it. And our regulatory framework needs to take that into account. That means that people working on Power-to-X things, for example, needs to get the incentives to produce a lot when there's not a lot of demand. And we're not doing that at the moment. We're giving them support to build the factory or build the thing, and produce all the time instead of the other way around. So it's a matter of having a very climate clever regulatory framework for everybody to earn money in and create profit in within that framework. And we are not very good at that because we are not focused on the right things.
Marie, how do you solve that as a politician?
Well, it's not easy. and the issue you brought up there, that's something we have been negotiating about almost a year ago now, I think. And it wasn't possible legally to do it the way Christian wanted to have it done. A lot of politicians wanted it that way because we wanted the initiative to produce when the electricity is cheap. You know that. But the thing is, then we wouldn't have it produced. So sometimes it's also about getting something to start, and then we will see where it will go. It was the same with wind. Maybe that could have been a failure in the 80s. It wasn't, luckily.
When you're a politician, you're elected for some years, 4 years, 3.5. How much
we'll see.
time it will take? if there is ever a government in Denmark.
Uncertain period right now.
Yeah, and that means that compared to, for instance, CORC, which has a 10 or even longer perspective, then you have a shorter perspective. Can you feel that when you take your decisions that you need to not to, pardon my language, but not to mess it up too much on a short scale?
Oh, some degree, yes. I think we have been focusing too much on setting a high climate goal, which has been right to do. I'm not arguing that it's wrong to do that, but that's a way of showing we are doing something. We are acting. We are very ambitious. See, we're putting these goals. But if you look at what have we actually reduced of CO2, what have we actually done on the short term, then it's hard to see. And I think we need more action on reducing CO2 emissions. But first of all, it's very complicated. But also, it takes time. And as a politician, you won't gain credit for that for such a short time. It's easier as a politician to say, oh, I want a higher goal. 70 is not enough. I want 80 now. That's more easy to be measured on. I think that's a political problem.
Bruce, when you're at this point in your technology and dreaming of a scale that is larger, what would be a good driver to creating that scale? Obviously, like you need some investors and some money, but what do you actually need to drive such a process? You can say money.
Besides investors, what you need are very good people working on it that have a dedicated vision of where it's going. To take something, not to say anything against startups, but the problem is a startup is blood, sweat, and tears. And the people that do that put their life into that. And then if somebody just goes and buys them up or whatever, they've gotten a lot more than they pay for it. At $2 billion, it's a deal. At $5 billion. And so I think that really finding the right people who are dedicated to what they're doing, but can set an example for others, and that's what you've done. You've set an example for others that if you have a vision and you really put your mind to it and your energy into it, that you can make it succeed. And that's the critical factor, like many things. Tell me one thing that hasn't succeeded, because they had a champion. And so we need some really good.
Is there a lesson to be learned from the American system to a Danish or European perspective?
In this space, I'm not sure that there is. I think what Denmark has done with their electricity generation is nothing short of brilliant. And I think the rest of the world should sit back and figure out what you do with the natural gas and the petroleum dependency, and then you'll have set a global model. And that's really what we have to think about, is that global model.
Before I give you the word, Christian, then I'm opening up, so I'll have my eyes on both sides now. Christian, please.
Yeah, just to spark some interest into this also, I mean, the thing about the Danish energy and climate policy is also that we're opening up for being a vital part of the European transition, which I think is really key to the policies in Denmark, because in the energy system is all about, of course, different kind of direct use of electricity, getting enough power in from the North Sea and so on, but also translating that into contributing to the European decarbonization. A lot of the North Sea will have to do with Europe, in powering Europe also. A lot of what you're doing on biogas is not about, bringing biogas to Lolland and a sugar factory where all your press is about. It's about being that part of getting rid of natural gas from Russia and other places in Europe, and maybe even the world. I think sometimes in Denmark we get into the wrong conversations, and then we get enemies and friends instead of discussing how can we contribute to what we really need to achieve. So, for example, about European gas and dependency on Russia is about getting rid of the gas in all the sectors that we need in gas to power, gas to heat, no gas in transport, and so on. And the gas that will still will be a lot of biogas. So now you're a friend and not an enemy in terms of do we need biogas in Lolland or not. So we are having a lot of discussions around the wrong priorities in Denmark. Instead of having, how can we build that electrified society that Bruce talked about now, and use the other resource that we do, green hydrogen, biogas and others, in a way that can contribute to the European or even global transformation.
So which discussion do you want to be taken? The resource discussion, could you touch upon that?
We need climate efficiency and resource efficiency in our climate policy. We need an action plan next 2 years that goes in terms of implementation. We have proposed a 2-year action plan that talks about all the barriers that we have in different sectors, all the tenders renewable energy in the North Sea and others, electricity system, whatever it is, our tax system is wrong. So how do we do an action plan in 2 years that brings us to a point that we can aim to achieve more than 70% or even decarbonize further? But we need to get the barriers out of the way. We need to prioritize resources. For example, the research going into biogas is the same resources that we might put into pyrolysis. I don't know how you do that in English, but or whatever it is. So you need to prioritize what kind of resources do we need to put into what kind of process and what we need to put out on the other side.
Søren?
I agree to a large extent. I fully agree to the electrification. Let's electrify everything possible, right? A good starting point. There are some hard-to-abate industries where gas has a relevance. That's what we kind of try to abate on. I also just want to take a second to acknowledge the government scheme, the subsidies, right? I think the biogas industry is a good example of what that can do. Right, of 8 years of subsidies-ish has brought us from almost 0 to almost 40% of biogas or biomethane in the Danish gas grid. I think that's remarkable. But going into prioritization, I do agree we cannot do everything half, but I think the challenge here that we are against is so big that we basically need to turn all the levers full. Yes. So basically, if I have to choose, I would choose speed over priority. I know it's not that blunt a choice. And the flip side of that coin is that we do risk running out of avenues that turns to be a dead end. But I think that's where the strength comes from, combining universities, different industries, private sectors and government and institutions. I think that's where the strength comes in this, that we can actually invest or prioritize multiple avenues that eventually together will get us there. Yes.
While you're considering questions, I have one, and it's for you, Bruce, and it's technical.
Oh!
Hi, Dr. Logan. How fast is the rate and scale of EET from cathode in context of mathematical modeling of MES? Does this make sense to you? Is there any LCA study available? Thanks a lot.
Whoa.
Should we make sure that you're combined with the gentleman or
I think
woman
maybe
posing
that's
this
a question for an offline answer.
I think that was
I think
a
I will
wonderful
spare everybody that one.
Okay, there are some technical issues to be solved out here. Any further questions? Yes, please. Yeah. First here. Oh, yeah, whatever. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Tanmay Chaturvedi from Aalborg University. I have a question for Sen. About 3 years ago, what was the priority or what was Nature Energy thinking about before this energy crisis? What were your top priorities? And how has that changed because we are in an energy crisis?
Good question.
Yeah. First of all, we for the last 3 years, we've had the same growth strategy, right? We started our lab and our R&D facilities in 2018 with the focus on technology, and we have the growth strategy again because size matters. We need to the more similar plants we have, the more bang for the buck we get when implementing new technology. So that strategy has been there 3 years back. So what has happened, right? That strategy has gotten a boost. To be honest, we in not only Denmark but in Europe, when we talk about green energy, we're talking about power, wind and solar. That has changed the last year. Now we also talk about biogas, and we have a lot of European politicians calling us for advice and action plans on how we can help the different countries.
And so I know what they are asking you when they call you. They say, "How fast can you do this?"
Yes.
And what do you answer them?
From when all the barriers are gone, we can have a full biogas plant of this industrial scale size in 18 months.
And in the real world?
We often spend a couple of years getting to that point, and then when we have the biogas plants, we have also developed a technique that we can ramp it up to 100% within a few months.
How much are your phone ringing these days? From Shell, but from who wants to?
No, I don't think it's more, but from early year we have attended a lot of online and physical meetings with different parties across Europe, especially to find out ways to do it. And there are discussions on appointing some fast track areas where we can try and remove some of the barriers to get quicker to biogas.
Are you taking German lessons?
Not personally, no.
Please.
Yeah, I'm Jamie from Kalundborg Refinery, so I might be the black sheep in this room. So the energy crisis, I guess, started in Europe, but it's very much globally at the moment. So energy prices in Europe are really high, but it's also cascading down to developing countries which are facing really high prices for electricity and resources. How do we ensure a level playing field globally in an energy market that is very global?
Yeah, Christian, would you start on that one?
I don't have the answer. Anybody in the room? How to ensure a level playing field globally on the energy market? Is that the question?
If you think of the emerging economies, like Simon was into, like there is a case to be made there, right?
Well, it depends on what kind of energy markets you're talking about. I guess the one of the things you're always discussing how do CO2 apply on the energy markets across globally, because we might do that in Denmark. We might also do that in Europe. We already did some of it, but in the energy market, it's also about resource development in terms of new technology. Are we talking about support or assistance in terms of deployment?
It might be more sort of in Europe. Would we sort of live with high energy prices? We will be most likely in the next foreseeable future, but for policymakers and the like, should we just accept a higher electricity cost or energy cost in Europe?
No, to that I don't think we should accept that. I think we should do a whole lot more in introducing all the low-cost technologies and climate-friendly technologies like wind. And there are answers to this, how to deal with this. And of course, we are in a transition period that are much faster than we were supposed to. And we should have done this a long time ago, introducing a lot more wind and others. So we are now in a pricing that's only got to do with the backup gas turbines being turned on, and that determines the price. And of course, the price signal needs to be right to get the offshore windmill industry getting paid for when they produce it or whatever. So I think there is a problem on getting a socially acceptable energy system going for the next transitional period of whatever year, 4 years or more. And that could be done through social policies, I think. Mostly it could be done by social policy and maybe not only through the energy system.
What do you mean by social policy?
By meaning there will be energy poverty in Europe, maybe even transport poverty in the next coming years because of energy prices. And that, of course, is up to the individual governments to lever that in some kind of way. Right now, I think Ulrik talked about it also, we are trying to put a lot of signals into the market to limit the profits from the energy providers. And that can be a short-term okay solution. But of course, the incentives goes the wrong way around because we need to build a lot more. Because the answer to this is to build a lot more wind than others and to develop technologies that helps building a solid energy system while enhancing renewables that much.
2 questions up here. First there, and then there.
Owen Rattigan from GreenLab. So we talk about the idea that we need a high carbon price to forward this, but that will mean animal agriculture will be on the wrong side of the carbon price. Does that put biogas in a bad position going forward?
Who's the question to?
Challenge.
Biogas.
That's a challenge.
Anyone that can answer this, but mostly to biogas, I guess.
Yes and no. Depends on how it's thought together right across the full value chain in my perspective. And yes, it could be implemented that the agriculture has tough times ahead for sure. My personal opinion is that we have a very efficient agriculture setup in Denmark compared to other countries. And I don't think that we should push this outside Denmark. We should find ways to make it better. To find ways to make less emissions, to use that term, on an already efficient setup. Well, that's a personal opinion. I don't have the solution to it, but I hope that will be the end solution when putting together CO2 tickets, basically.
Ibsen, and then I don't know, Marie, if you want to comment on that as well.
You're pinpointing to an issue that was just about what I said, that you need a level playing field and you need to accept that you will be in an area where there will be a high carbon price. That will also include the agricultural sector. We can discuss the price and so on. The issue is, of course, and the Climate Council of Denmark just a few hours ago also put out a report that talked about methane as a special issue in Denmark. That also goes into cows and stuff. So we need to do something. I agree. There's no way we should just move this to other countries. That makes no sense in any case, because anything we do need to be put in a global perspective. But what is the answer in the biogas industry? Of course, we need to find out that. That's a dilemma. To find out, that's one of the ways to decarbonize the agriculture sector. But is it enough? And what will be the effect of the carbon price that we will put on it? There's a broad majority in finding a carbon tax. So you're putting a very valid question. I don't have the answer.
Marie, I think this really ends back at your table, right?
Yes, it is a challenge, but not obviously. I agree with the Søren remarks. We have a very climate effective agriculture, and also there's a lot of benefits from that agriculture going into biogas in the future, or maybe very, very soon. We'll also use the waste in the pyrolyze to get even more out of it. I firmly believe we have to come up with a solution that makes our agriculture even more green and in the future CO2 neutral. Perhaps measuring the CO2 emissions from agriculture can bring us there, knowing that it's a hard challenge, though.
I think we have the last 2 questions now, here and there.
Well, where's the carbon? Where's the carbon? Question is that if you look at the carbon available biomass resource as such, we have biogas now, which really is taking off and can be scaled, and we can do this all with 700 plants in Europe. Now we have 20,000. We can just do 700 third generation plants. We're there. which is a fantastic development. Politicians, whatever, the political system, I'm sitting from the foundation now, that we like sort of how can we help and be part of driving forward. It's really hard to pick anything. If it's 360 degrees all the way around, where do you want to go? Which technologies? We need to pick something here. And right now we have biogas moving at full speed, and it looks like you solve a lot of the problems. But if we also want to have pyrolysis, which is still a very, very young technology, currently a low carbon efficiency, there's not enough biomass, or neither. So isn't this, and the speed we need, and we need to have this in place now, should we look at the decisions we made a year, 2 years ago, and say, well, we probably need to reprioritize now for what we know. Good news, some technology has moved ahead, and there's even more potential, what Bruce has shown. Do we need to take a look at what we decided 2 years ago and said, we need to prioritize now because there's a need for speed now, and we do already have something that we know works.
And if I may just take the question a little bit further, is that when we have new knowledge, let's reconvene and see what the solution should be. But don't we then get into the same pit as we talked about before, that we risk that having a course that goes forth and back all the time?
Yeah, we need to adjust. I mean, we need to adjust as we move ahead. It's just that we made a decision 2 years ago, and that should be the guiding principle towards 2050. No. We need to be able to adjust the course as we learn. That's just...
There will be a lot of adjusting. I guess I will not maybe take the... Maybe you want to start?
Well, I can try. Well, generally, yes, we always have to look at what decision we took 2 years ago, evaluate and see whether that was the right decisions. But I think we should be reluctant in picking the winners too soon, especially as a politician, because we don't necessarily know what will be the solution in the future. That's why I'm coming to that. We don't necessarily know what will be the solution. Bruce has some solution, others have other solutions. I think it's very important that we create a legal framework where those ideas can develop. At some point, we need to pick a winner. That's why we have regulated and a certain strategic for wind, for solar, PTX production, also electricity costs. When we adopted that, people were saying, "Oh, why are you focusing on that? Because the future will be hydrogen." So at some point, but we need to make a space for companies to develop ideas, not to pick the winners too soon.
Klaus, I guess my answer to Klaus, I think I guess where he wants to go, but I'm not sure. There's some things you can prioritize and pick. You know, you need to electrify everywhere. You need to store a lot of CO2. You need to prioritize the green hydrogen where it's needed, and so on. But I guess what you're also pointing to, for example, on the biomass, we should produce much more biomass probably in Denmark and in Europe for different kind of purposes. Pyrolysis, biogas and so on, on what areas when we still want more nature and drinking water and whatever priorities that we have. The other thing, what are we using it for? In Denmark we're using it for maybe the wrong reasons, and we could use it for a lot of reasons for climate that are much better.
Are you talking about more energy crops in Denmark?
There could be. Of course, if we a lot of issues around where we would need to produce, that of course has to do, we have also need to produce much more food on less area in Denmark. So how do that? Much more efficient agriculture, producing different crops and so on, because we still need to feed the world. So there's a lot of dilemmas. I think Klaus is pointing to some of it. And we need to get that. That's why we have asked for a bioresource strategy. We never had that. What kind of bioresources are we producing and what are we using them for? I guess Søren will like that strategy as well.
I saw Marie take a note when you said that about that strategy. Okay, last question down here. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Les. I'm working with biogas in the ministry. And I have a question for Søren. Do you expect to become independent of state aid for your production? Because that would really enable you to accelerate the production, I guess. And if so, when and what would enable that? Under which conditions?
The simple answer is yes. That has been a target for Nature Energy since the day we started getting subsidies. It's the biogas 3.0 that I showed on one of my slides that will enable that. It's utilizing carbon better to creating multiple revenue streams out of a biogas facility. That is what will enable it. So we do have projects in our pipeline on greenfield projects, building new biogas facilities that we expect to be without any sort of subsidies. But the journey of getting the current plants out of subsidies is longer. Right, and that being said, part of our subsidies. What is longer? Just want to say, part of our subsidy schemes is about half, I think, is depending on the gas price. So that's very close to zero these days, because of the high gas price. The latter one, I think it's 20 years agreement was made from the day that the plant started. So that's at least the last point, right? So we have plants that is now. That's running out of subsidy in the next 10 years, I would say, and others that has close to 20 years left in Denmark. And we will build new ones without. Might also have new ones with subsidies depending on the geography and opportunities to add different revenue streams. So it's a little of both, but we do have a target to get out of subsidy schemes.
Someday you'll see a tender where you have to bid to buy,
to
build
but
a biogas.
there's a new subsidy scheme coming which increase demands on different parameters, which we welcome. We're currently trying to decipher that to find out if that's honestly a benefit, or we'd rather try the avenue without.
Okay, that concludes our panel discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Thank you. And while you are leaving the stage, I will invite Executive Director Alfred Spormann up here again. And Alfred, you're not coming here to talk right now? No. A microphone would be useful, though. Instead, you have another mission of being here right now for the concluding remarks.
Ida and I, we thought, how can we wrap this up and really sort of bring this really intense and fruitful discussion back to the audience for whom we all made this, right? So this first Carbon Forum was for you. I mean, it brought good people together, but in the end, it was here, the intent was to inspire you with thoughts that you haven't heard, meet colleagues that you haven't heard, and also provide some perspectives on that. So we thought it might be a good idea just to, collect some simple ideas of what is it that you really heard here, what was interesting to you, what was inspiring for you, what you haven't heard or thought of. Probably another round of thinking was, well, what needs to be changing in terms of our culture, how we work together. So we're in the science trench, there's the trench of the industry, and there's the trench of the politicians, the regulators, and investment. These are all trenches. We are up for speed and scale. How much can we afford to keep on doing that, or what would be other models? So there's no clear answer, but I really want to hear, especially from the quiet ones that observed this entire day, what have you learned and what piqued your interest? So,
please. And you don't have to wait for the microphone, because Alfred and I, we said that we will just repeat what you've been saying. So shoot.
Whenever.
I come from a technology transfer point of view, so this is the intermediary trying to, hopefully in the positive sense, build the bridges between the trenches so that people can get out of it. And I think what we probably need to do here is to band together, get out of our trenches, and really have open and honest discussions with each other. We need to fence them in with confidentiality where it's needed, but I think we really need
So I'm just repeating it for the record. Open and honest discussion from different stakeholders that actually have not been working together, and include policymakers, scientists, and companies to openly talk what the really important issues are, and then jointly in a trustful environment come to paths forward that can be done rapidly. Yeah, thank you. There must be other thoughts.
Yeah, over here, please.
Eskil.
Yeah, my name is Eskil Holm Nielsen. I'm the dean at the technical sciences at Aarhus University, one of the home for the CORC Center. So Alfie actually asked me to say what were your impression. So first of all, I'd like to say that I think the forum, it worked very well. I think it is very seldom that we have a dialogue across academia, industry, government bodies and NGOs where we don't have the parade up as much. So I really appreciate that and thank you for that. Then I also said that I think Martin Victoria also gave us food for thought in the scaling issue. So I actually don't think we can make it, but let's try it. And another positive, not to be negative, but to be positive, I actually think the biomethane potentials are there. But we need to do much more focusing on doing the right things, not to do things right. Because we now need to go into action. And there I really think that we also need to take the lessons from the wind turbines. It took them 30 years to scale up, and we have less than 10 years to scale up this. So there are need for doing mistakes, and there is a need to really scale up things. So thank you.
Thanks, Eskil. Just to add to that, coming from the science field where 90% of our work is failure, right? And that's how we learn things.
Not like politicians.
We get money for that. If you then move to the other areas like industry or policy where failure is devastating, it's not part of the process, but it's a bad thing to fail. I personally feel that really inhibits the field, because you only learn by making mistakes, and you will inherently do mistakes, and you don't know what the winning technologies are, and there will be attempts that will not work out, and that's okay. Considering the $1 trillion scale that we are working on, it doesn't cost anything. But to start doing things what we believe is the right way now, but also keeping the complexity and speed in mind is important. So I want to make an argument for failing is good. Okay.
Here and afterwards, Jarl.
My name's William. I'm from Novo Holdings, and I'm actually based in Singapore, and I head up the bioindustrials investments for Novo Holdings. I think the issues discussed today is not unique to Denmark. It is actually a global problem. And the solution to this really, besides having the technology in place, is also the financing. And I think the concept of blended finance is really important. And I was just in Bali for G20, and I think blended finance was really one of the things that G20 was, and B20, the business side event, was trying to advocate, right? That in blended finance, the importance of having tripartite money coming in to solve this problem is really the key. So the tripartite refers to the 3 Ps, yeah? The first P is public, so it's government money. Second P is philanthropic, so the foundation money. And the third P is private holdings money, right? So in Denmark, I think Novo is great in helping that together with the Danish government, with Novo Holdings and Novo Nordisk Foundation. And I think in Asia, there will be opportunities for us to think about the blended finance in a similar way. Right? Thank you.
I'm taking this one because now it begins, friends. Now I see the hands.
Thank you, Ida. I'm Jart Krausen, also coming from Concito.
And first of all, I want to congratulate Alfred and the team for really, I think, launching a perfectly timed conference series. I think it can make a huge difference because one of the challenges I think we have is really how to bring, basic research into the political space and understanding what the opportunities really are. And I think one takeaway, which I think is very important here, is by bringing people together and understanding, the complexities that you actually are confronted with as a technology or solution developer, and bringing it into a marketplace is an area where we need to really remove a lot of barriers and bottlenecks. And thinking about this mission approach across any aspect that you are coming into this marketplace will be critical. And I think it is one takeaway from here that we need to take it to that level. So this was a great first step, I think.
Great, thanks. Back here, behind you.
Yes, Lars Ottosen from Aarhus University. So I was actually very inspired by Simon. I don't know if he's still here, but yeah. So Simon, you showed that the consequences of taking just a small fraction of the fossil fuels out of the equation. So I think a really important message here is that what we thought was a well-functioning energy market and system before the crisis showed really, really vulnerable. And according to Martha, as we are taking out, I mean, when we are phasing out fossils, if we don't prepare the energy system to handle that, then we are going to see one crisis after the other if we are going to comply with the goals we have. So I mean, just taking a small fraction of gas out of the market has increased the prices dramatically. And another thing which we haven't really discussed today is energy savings. So in my home institution, we have saved normalized 35% on the heating and 20% on the electricity at Aarhus University. It can be noticed, I can tell you that in the offices, but still. So that's another element that's very interesting, how the energy system reacts to perturbance like this.
Let me say from you, Martha, because we didn't touch upon it in your presentation on the questions, that Martha's model is open. So everybody can join in. Though she told me it takes a little time to learn how to use it, which after seeing the equations, I guess must be true. But everyone can chip in or can join her in that project.
And if I had been a politician, I would have concluded that it's time to have the courage to planning and taking decisions, both on bioenergy, biomass, energy systems, and so forth. We know the task, we know what we have to do, and just by thinking about phasing out the fossils, well, it lays the track for a lot of planning that we actually might as well do now, and also have the courage to take some decisions on behalf of that. So.
And there are good friends to join on the course. Lige foran der, her foran der, yes.
Thank you. Sune Nygaard from DTI, Danish Technological Institute. Two takeaways. First of all, we really need to ramp it up right now. We don't have 35 years as we had with the wind turbines. So we need to take these, we need to invest, we need to find both private and public money, and at a much bigger scale. When we had the coronavirus 2 years ago, it feels like an eternity. We really did invest, and we took brave, courageous choices, and it made a difference. And then secondly, my main takeaway was that we are a broad forum here today, but we also need to invite those who are not, we kind of had a tendency to preach for the choir. I met with 20 business leaders yesterday, and I gave them a talk about green transition, and that we might be lacking carbon in the near future. And they were looking at me like they didn't have a clue about what I was talking about. So I think we need to have even broader forums and invite those that we normally don't speak to. So that's a takeaway.
I just thought maybe it'd be interesting for you to hear a real feedback of outsiders' perspective. You know, not really knowing the stakeholders, the landscape in Denmark, and listening to the discussion today. I mean, especially on the topic of biogas and biomethane, my impression is that your attempt to sort of generate adversaries and discussion on some of these topics actually, the vested interests, whether they are in the biogas industry, the government, the NGO community, are pretty well aligned on this. And I think that that's something that Denmark can take away. And so we can move forward because we've got a really good alignment of vested interests. I don't know how that changes when you get a big oil and gas company coming in whose vested interest is not in the decline of the gas industry, higher gas prices, etc. But that'll be something interesting to watch. The other thing that I just wanted to pick up on that was just mentioned is, the energy industry is very finely balanced. There are fine margins, and small disruptions can actually lead to huge consequences. And so this topic that was kind of touched on towards the end of the last panel around how do you make decisions that are resilient to future changes, and how do you have the bravery or the ability to be flexible in decision making, I think is a fascinating one. I don't think there is a country that you can point to and say, they've got this right. There are countries now, New Zealand, the UK, that have this system of carbon budgets, and that's one way of doing the planning with some flexibility. But I do think that the healthiest position to be in is if you can spread as much of the risks across borders as possible, whether it's the technology risks or whether it's being able to do policy experimentation in different regions and then share best practices. But that is something that I would certainly keep an eye on, because we are going to see more upheavals in the years to come.
And that concludes this little session. Alfred, do you have a closing remark? Otherwise, we are about to close our forum now.
Yeah, so I think this was I feel this is just the beginning, right? And I hope you can continue this with some refreshments downstairs, especially talk to those that you haven't talked before from other fields. Listen what they want to say, what they have to say. And, it needs creative solutions from all of us. So, first of all, I want to thank Ida for this terrific job in managing this entire day to ask pointing questions and probing questions and really keeping us focused. So I think this was phenomenal. So thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge Stephanie Christiansen in the back here and Tina Früland sitting here in the front, who have been instrumental in putting this Carbon Forum together and will so in the future, which actually leads me to the last slide. In case you want more of this, we have planned sort of this, to have this forum, this really discussion area, bringing different ideas and thoughts together for sharing knowledge, insights, understanding, solutions, and strategies. What we plan for the next year is sort of a Carbon Forum tentatively titled Carbon X versus Power to X, because the discussions are kind of complicated, with boundaries are difficult. And as we saw just in the end of the discussion, when we actually went fairly far away from the topic of this one, there is a need to also integrate that. What we also touched on today is the third function of biomass. So it's not only food, it's not only energy, but it's also carbon. So should Denmark invest more in agricultural carbon as a carbon entity? And then something that is also dear to my heart is, what is actually the social cost of carbon? We are measuring this in economic terms, but if we are considering that there will be hundreds of millions climate refugees by the mid of this century, that's predictable. We know that. How do we deal with that? How does this disrupt sort of the political, the social ecosystem, and so on and so forth? And in the end, how expensive is it actually not to do something now? So these are other topics that we are working with. Again, thank you so much for coming. That was a terrific audience. And please go down and talk to your neighbors and others and people that you haven't talked about. So thanks for coming.
That was